Every day during World War II, thousands of messages arrived at one address. Some announced victories, others reported disasters. Many contained secrets that could never appear in newspapers. Together, they told the story of a world at war, and they all arrived here, the White House. Most people think of the White House as the home of the American president, but during World War II, it became something far greater. It was a war room, a diplomatic battlefield, a place where kings, prime ministers, generals, spies, scientists, and ordinary Americans all crossed paths. Behind its famous white walls, Franklin Roosevelt made decisions that affected millions of lives. Winston Churchill walked its halls in slippers while planning the defeat of Nazi Germany. Secret maps tracked battles across Europe and the Pacific. Telephones rang through the night. Coded messages arrived every hour, and every morning began with one impossible question: what should America do next? But what was it really like to live and work inside the White House while the largest war in human history unfolded? How did an elegant presidential mansion transform into the nerve center of a global conflict? What did its staff witness that the public never saw? How were history's biggest decisions actually made? And what did the people inside that house sacrifice to keep a nation and an alliance moving forward? This is the story of the White House as you've never seen it before. Not as a monument, not as a museum, but as the beating heart of America's war effort. So step inside, close the doors behind you, and travel back to a time when the fate of the free world was decided one meeting, one message, and one impossible decision at a time. On most mornings in the late 1930s, the White House looked peaceful. The sun would rise over Washington, D.C., casting long shadows across the South Lawn. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Secretaries arrived carrying folders under their arms. Reporters gathered outside, hoping for a glimpse of the president or a hint of the day's announcements. Visitors saw a stately home, confident and calm, the very image of stability. But appearances could be deceiving. Behind those white columns, a growing sense of urgency was taking hold. The world beyond America's shores was changing with alarming speed, and the people inside the White House understood something that many ordinary Americans did not. Another global war was becoming increasingly likely. The challenge was not simply preparing for that possibility. The challenge was preparing without appearing to prepare. That delicate balancing act would define the years before the United States officially entered World War II. Every conversation, every policy, every speech delivered by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to navigate an increasingly divided nation. He had to strengthen America's defenses without convincing voters that he intended to drag the country into another European conflict. It was a political tightrope unlike anything an American president had faced before. To understand why, we have to go back even further. The memories of the First World War were still painfully fresh. Millions of Americans believed they had sacrificed lives and treasure in a conflict that should never have involved the United States. More than 116,000 American soldiers had died overseas. Families across the country still remembered sons who never returned home. Newspapers had once promised that it would be the war to end all wars. Instead, barely 2 decades later, Europe seemed to be heading toward another catastrophe. Many Americans asked a simple question: why should they become involved again? It was a question Roosevelt heard constantly. Across the country, isolationism had become one of the strongest political forces in American life. Organizations attracted millions of supporters by arguing that oceans protected the United States from Europe's endless conflicts. Prominent politicians insisted that America should focus on its own problems. Radio hosts warned listeners that foreign wars only benefited arms manufacturers and bankers. The Great Depression strengthened those beliefs. After the stock market crash of 1929, millions of Americans struggled simply to survive. Factories closed, banks failed, families lost farms and homes. Unemployment reached levels almost impossible to imagine today. For ordinary citizens, the greatest enemy seemed to be economic hardship, not distant dictators. Roosevelt knew this reality better than anyone. When he entered the White House in 1933, his immediate priority was not military expansion, it was economic recovery. Through the New Deal, his administration launched massive public works projects, banking reforms, employment programs, and social safety nets designed to restore confidence in the American economy. Yet even while tackling the Depression, Roosevelt kept one eye fixed across the Atlantic. He had followed European politics for years. Unlike many Americans, he did not believe the growing instability overseas would remain overseas forever. The rise of aggressive dictatorships deeply concerned him. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had transformed a struggling democracy into a totalitarian regime with astonishing speed. Political opponents disappeared, military spending exploded. The Treaty of Versailles, which had limited Germany after World War I, was openly ignored. Factories that had once produced civilian goods increasingly manufactured tanks, aircraft, and artillery. Across the Alps, Benito Mussolini had already demonstrated how fascist governments could seize power and pursue military conquest. Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, exposing the weakness of international organizations that were supposed to preserve peace. Meanwhile, in Asia, Imperial Japan pursued an equally aggressive path. Japanese forces occupied Manchuria in 1931 and expanded their invasion into China by 1937. Reports of horrific violence, including the massacre in Nanjing, reached Washington through diplomats, journalists, and missionaries. Roosevelt read these reports carefully. He saw a disturbing pattern developing across two continents. The international order established after World War I was beginning to collapse. Inside the White House, discussions became increasingly serious. Military advisors arrived carrying assessments of American readiness. The news was sobering. Although the United States possessed enormous industrial potential, its armed forces were surprisingly small. The U.S. Army ranked far below those of many European nations in size. Some divisions trained with wooden substitutes instead of modern weapons because equipment was scarce. Tanks were limited. Aircraft production lagged behind the rapid expansion occurring in Germany and Britain. Military budgets had remained relatively low throughout the Depression. America had wealth, America had factories, America had engineers, but it did not yet have a military prepared for global war. Roosevelt understood that building one would require time. Time, however, appeared to be running out. The president's challenge was complicated by another reality. Congress controlled funding. Many lawmakers represented districts where voters strongly opposed military expansion. Any proposal that seemed too aggressive risked political backlash. Roosevelt therefore adopted a gradual approach. Instead of demanding immediate mobilization, he framed military spending as insurance. Insurance against uncertainty. It was an argument easier for skeptical Americans to accept. Within the White House, planning accelerated quietly. Meetings grew longer. Military leaders visited more frequently. The president asked detailed questions. How quickly could aircraft factories increase production? Were American ports capable of handling a larger navy? How vulnerable were shipping lanes across the Atlantic? What resources would be needed if the country suddenly faced war? Every answer generated new questions. The White House increasingly became a place where economists, industrial experts, engineers, diplomats, and military officers all contributed to national strategy. Roosevelt believed wars were not won by armies alone. They were won by factories, by shipyards, by railroads, by steel production, by oil, by food, by transportation. Long before the first American soldier entered combat, he was already thinking about the economic foundations of victory. That perspective reflected America's unique strengths. Unlike many European nations, the United States possessed vast natural resources spread across an enormous continent. Coal fields fueled industry. Iron ore supplied steel mills. Oil flowed from Texas, Oklahoma, and California. Fertile farmland produced enough food not only for Americans, but eventually for millions of Allied troops overseas. The country's geography also offered extraordinary advantages. Two great oceans separated America from the world's major battlefields. Those oceans made invasion extremely difficult. At the same time, extensive river systems, rail networks, and highways connected factories with ports more efficiently than in many other countries. Roosevelt understood that geography bought America something precious: time. If that time was used wisely, the United States could transform itself into the greatest industrial power the world had ever seen. But first, it had to convince its own people that preparation was necessary. One of Roosevelt's greatest political skills was his ability to communicate directly with ordinary Americans. His fireside chats became legendary. Families gathered around radios in living rooms across the nation, listening as the president spoke in a calm, reassuring voice. He rarely sounded dramatic. He explained complicated issues in language people could understand. Instead of creating panic, he tried to build confidence. When discussing international affairs, Roosevelt carefully balanced warning with reassurance. He acknowledged the dangers abroad while insisting that America sought peace. Privately, however, his concerns were becoming increasingly urgent. The White House received a steady flow of diplomatic reports from embassies around the world. Ambassadors described Germany's rapid rearmament. British officials warned that Hitler's ambitions extended far beyond restoring national pride. French leaders feared another devastating invasion. American military attachés reported improvements in German aircraft, armored tactics, and military organization. These reports crossed Roosevelt's desk almost daily. They painted a picture very different from the one many Americans saw in newspapers. Then came one of the defining moments of the decade. In September 1938, Europe confronted the Sudeten crisis. Hitler demanded territory from Czechoslovakia. Britain and France, desperate to avoid another world war, agreed to negotiations that produced the Munich Agreement. Many celebrated the deal as a triumph of diplomacy. Roosevelt was less optimistic. He feared that concessions would encourage further aggression. His fears proved well-founded. Within months, Germany occupied the rest of Czechoslovakia, demonstrating that Hitler's ambitions had never been limited to protecting ethnic Germans. Inside the White House, optimism faded. Military planning intensified. Roosevelt increasingly sought advice from trusted figures who could think beyond politics. Among them were Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall and Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Harold Stark. Both understood the enormous gap between America's potential strength and its current military capabilities. Marshall, in particular, impressed Roosevelt with his professionalism. Unlike some officers eager for publicity, Marshall focused relentlessly on preparation. He emphasized organization, logistics, and training. He understood that modern warfare required more than brave soldiers. It required planning on an unprecedented scale. Roosevelt appreciated that approach. He often encouraged disagreement during meetings. Rather than demanding instant agreement, he wanted competing viewpoints. Staff members sometimes joked that discussions inside the White House resembled debates more than conferences. The president listened, asked questions, changed his mind, returned to earlier ideas. He preferred flexibility over rigid doctrine. That habit occasionally frustrated advisors, but it also allowed Roosevelt to adapt as world events evolved, and events were moving rapidly. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war. World War II had begun. The White House immediately entered a new phase. Although the United States remained officially neutral, neutrality no longer meant indifference. Roosevelt recognized that Britain's survival mattered enormously to American security. If Britain fell, Nazi Germany could dominate Europe, control immense industrial resources, and threaten the Atlantic itself. Helping Britain, therefore, became a strategic necessity. The difficulty lay in doing so without violating neutrality laws or provoking political outrage at home. Once again, Roosevelt searched for creative solutions. He persuaded Congress to modify neutrality legislation through the cash and carry policy. Countries at war could purchase American weapons if they paid cash and transported the goods themselves. It sounded technical. In reality, it overwhelmingly benefited Britain. German warships could hardly visit American ports to buy supplies. Britain, protected by its powerful navy, could. The policy marked a subtle but significant shift. America remained officially neutral, yet the White House was already choosing sides. Behind closed doors, officials understood exactly what was happening. The United States was slowly becoming what Roosevelt hoped would be the arsenal of democracy. Factories received larger orders. Industrial production increased. Defense contracts multiplied. Shipyards expanded. Aircraft manufacturers hired thousands of new workers. The transformation had begun long before Pearl Harbor. It happened quietly, almost invisibly at first. Few Americans realized that the White House was already laying the foundations for the greatest mobilization in the nation's history. The mansion on Pennsylvania Avenue still hosted receptions and ceremonies. Visitors still admired its elegant rooms. Photographers still captured smiling officials on its front steps. But beneath that familiar routine, something profound was changing. The White House was no longer simply governing a nation at peace. It was preparing, carefully, cautiously, and often secretly, for a war that many hoped would never reach America's shores. It would not have to wait much longer. The morning of Sunday, December 7, 1941, began with remarkable ordinariness. Washington, D.C. was quieter on Sundays than during the work week. Government offices were largely closed. Church bells echoed through the city. Families lingered over breakfast. The streets around the White House carried less traffic, and for a few hours the relentless pace of government seemed to slow. Inside the executive mansion, however, work never truly stopped. Even on Sundays, members of the White House staff reported for duty. Secret Service agents rotated shifts. Military aides monitored communications. Telephone operators remained at their switchboards. Butlers prepared meals. Housekeepers moved quietly through the residence. The presidential household functioned every day of the year, regardless of holidays or weekends. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had settled into what appeared to be another routine Sunday. Although America was still officially at peace, the nation had been living under growing tension for months. Negotiations with Japan had deteriorated steadily. Washington knew that relations with Tokyo were nearing a breaking point. The question was no longer whether a crisis would come. The question was where. Military leaders expected Japan to strike somewhere in Southeast Asia. The Philippines, British Malaya, Thailand, or the Dutch East Indies all seemed likely targets. Some worried about Guam or Wake Island. Others believed Japan might attack British possessions to seize oil and rubber. Few imagined that the opening blow would fall nearly 5,000 miles away against the U.S. Pacific Fleet anchored at Pearl Harbor. Even fewer imagined how quickly that attack would transform life inside the White House. That afternoon, Washington time, the first alarming reports began arriving. The initial messages were confusing, telegrams were brief, telephone calls were interrupted. Military communications often contradicted one another. One report suggested an air raid. Another implied sabotage. Some officers struggled to believe what they were hearing. A major attack on Hawaii seemed almost impossible. Surely there had been some mistake. Surely someone had misidentified American aircraft. Surely this was another false alarm. Then the information became impossible to ignore. Japanese carrier-based aircraft had launched a massive surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Battleships were burning, airfields were under bombardment, hundreds of aircraft were being destroyed, casualties were mounting by the minute. The White House shifted from a Sunday residence into a wartime command center almost instantly. Military aides hurried through hallways carrying handwritten notes. Telephones rang continuously. Operators struggled to connect calls as senior officials attempted to reach one another across Washington. The president's advisors began arriving with extraordinary speed. Some came directly from church. Others rushed over from their homes without even changing clothes. Cabinets that normally contained briefing papers quickly filled with incoming reports. Every available piece of information was gathered. Every rumor was evaluated. Every confirmed fact was passed directly to Roosevelt. The president remained remarkably calm. Those who knew Roosevelt had seen this quality before. He possessed an unusual ability to separate emotion from decision-making during moments of crisis. He did not waste time expressing outrage. He did not panic. He asked questions, precise questions. How extensive was the damage? Had additional bases been attacked? Where was the Japanese fleet? Were the Philippines under assault? What had happened to the aircraft carriers? Could this be the beginning of a wider offensive? Each answer revealed only part of a rapidly expanding disaster. The attack on Pearl Harbor was not an isolated strike. Within hours, reports confirmed Japanese attacks across the Pacific: Guam, Wake Island, the Philippines, Hong Kong, Malaya, Thailand. The Pacific seemed to be erupting all at once. The carefully coordinated offensive demonstrated years of planning. Inside the White House, officials immediately realized they were witnessing more than a naval attack. They were watching the opening moves of a global war, one room after another filled with senior leaders. Secretary of War Henry Stimson arrived, carrying the weight of grim experience. At 74 years old, he had served multiple presidents and understood both diplomacy and war. The normally composed Stimson immediately grasped the historical significance of what was unfolding. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox soon joined the discussions. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, delayed because he had been horseback riding earlier that morning and was initially difficult to reach, quickly entered the growing circle of advisors once informed. Admiral Harold Stark, Chief of Naval Operations, began assembling the latest reports from Hawaii. The conversations were relentless. No one spoke for long before another telephone interrupted. No briefing lasted more than a few minutes before new information forced everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew. One report estimated severe damage to battleships. Another described destroyed aircraft lined wingtip to wingtip on airfields. Then came the first casualty estimates. They were horrifying. Yet no one knew the final numbers. Every hour brought revisions. Every revision made the situation worse. Amid this whirlwind of military updates, another crucial figure quietly assumed her own role. Eleanor Roosevelt had been giving a scheduled radio broadcast when news of the attack reached her. Like everyone else, she had only fragments of information. Instead of canceling her address, she chose to continue. Speaking directly to millions of Americans, she acknowledged that the nation faced an emergency unlike any it had experienced in generations. Her tone was neither dramatic nor theatrical. It was steady, measured, reassuring. She understood that fear spreads quickly. Confidence had to spread faster. Back at the White House, she joined her husband. The two had developed an extraordinary partnership over decades of public life. Though they often disagreed on policy and maintained unusually independent schedules, moments of national crisis brought them together with remarkable unity. As military leaders focused on strategy, Eleanor instinctively thought about ordinary families. How would mothers react? What about soldiers' wives? What should the country hear first? How could panic be prevented? These questions mattered because the White House understood something essential. Wars are fought not only on battlefields, they are also fought in the minds of civilians. Public confidence would become one of America's greatest strategic resources. Meanwhile, another challenge confronted Roosevelt. He had to determine whether Pearl Harbor represented the full extent of the danger. No one knew where Japan might strike next. Could the West Coast be attacked? Were submarines already approaching California? Could aircraft carriers launch raids against Seattle, San Francisco, or Los Angeles? Was the Panama Canal at risk? What about Alaska? Every possibility demanded consideration. Maps were spread across tables. Military planners traced shipping routes. Commanders assessed defensive positions. The oceans that had once seemed to protect America suddenly felt much smaller. Outside the White House, rumors swept through Washington. Some claimed Japanese aircraft had been spotted approaching the capital. Others insisted enemy saboteurs had landed along the Pacific coast. Gas stations filled with anxious motorists. Stores experienced sudden crowds. Telephone networks became overloaded as families tried desperately to contact relatives. Fear thrives in the absence of information. The White House knew that clear communication would soon become just as important as military action. Throughout the afternoon, Roosevelt remained remarkably focused. Despite the emotional shock, he never lost sight of the larger strategic picture. He recognized almost immediately that Japan had almost certainly coordinated its attack with Germany and Italy. The conflict America had tried so hard to avoid was no longer limited to the Pacific. Within days, Adolf Hitler would declare war on the United States, transforming separate regional conflicts into one truly global struggle. Even before that formal declaration, Roosevelt sensed the direction events were moving. America would not fight one enemy. It would fight an alliance. Late that afternoon, attention turned toward Congress. The Constitution required a declaration of war. Roosevelt intended to ask for one immediately, but first he needed to address the nation. He understood that millions of Americans were frightened, confused, and searching for leadership. Words mattered. Perhaps no words would matter more than those he was about to choose. The drafting process began inside the White House that evening. Contrary to popular myth, Roosevelt did not simply sit alone and write effortlessly. The speech emerged through discussion, revision, and careful consideration. Early drafts passed between the president and trusted advisors. Every sentence was examined, every phrase carried enormous weight. Roosevelt believed brevity would give the speech greater power. Rather than delivering a lengthy historical lecture, he focused on the central fact. The United States had been attacked deliberately and without warning. One phrase became legendary. Initially, an early draft described December 7th as a date which will live in world history. Roosevelt personally crossed out those words. In their place, he wrote a single word: infamy. That change transformed the speech. Infamy conveyed more than historical importance. It expressed betrayal, treachery, moral outrage. The phrase would become one of the most recognizable lines ever spoken by an American president. While Roosevelt refined his address, White House staff worked through the night. Typists prepared multiple copies. Military couriers carried updated intelligence. Secretaries coordinated appointments. Telephone operators handled an endless stream of calls from governors, military commanders, cabinet officials, congressional leaders, and foreign diplomats. The building had become a hive of uninterrupted activity. Almost no one slept. In the White House kitchen, cooks prepared meals that often went untouched. Coffee flowed constantly. Ashtrays filled rapidly as officials smoked through endless meetings. The clocks seemed to lose their meaning. Day blended into night. The emergency erased ordinary schedules. Downstairs, the Secret Service quietly increased security. The possibility of sabotage could no longer be dismissed. Additional guards appeared around entrances. Visitor procedures tightened. Every unknown face attracted attention. Although Washington had not been attacked, the nation's capital now occupied a completely different psychological landscape. War had arrived. The transformation extended beyond security. The emotional atmosphere inside the White House changed forever. For years, Roosevelt had prepared cautiously for the possibility of conflict, while hoping diplomacy might still preserve peace. Now that hope had vanished. Every person inside the building understood that the coming months, and likely years, would demand sacrifices on a scale no living American had experienced. Some staff members worried about sons already serving in uniform. Others wondered whether they themselves would soon leave government service for military duty. Even those whose jobs would keep them in Washington sensed that their lives had entered an entirely new chapter. As midnight approached, lights continued burning throughout the White House, maps remained open, telephones continued ringing, new reports still arrived from across the Pacific. Some brought better news than expected. Others revealed fresh disasters. The flow never stopped. Roosevelt finally retired only after ensuring that he would be awakened immediately if significant developments occurred. The following morning, he would travel to Capitol Hill to deliver a speech lasting barely 7 minutes. It would unite a divided nation with extraordinary speed. Congress would declare war on Japan almost unanimously. Millions of young Americans would soon volunteer for military service. Factories would begin converting to wartime production at breathtaking speed. The United States would embark upon the greatest military mobilization in its history, but all of that still lay ahead. For now, inside the White House, December 7th was ending, much as it had unfolded, not with certainty, but with unanswered questions. How many ships had truly been lost? How many lives? Where would Japan strike next? Could America recover quickly enough? No one inside the executive mansion yet knew the answers. They knew only one thing with absolute certainty. The White House they had awakened in that Sunday morning no longer existed. By nightfall, it had become the command center of a nation at war. On the morning of December 8, 1941, the White House woke up in a different world. The change could not be seen from Pennsylvania Avenue. The white columns were still immaculate. The fountains still flowed. The American flag continued to wave above the roof. To someone walking past the iron fence, the executive mansion looked exactly as it had the week before. But inside, almost everything had changed. The building that had served as the president's residence for nearly a century and a half suddenly found itself at the center of the largest military conflict in human history. It had never been designed for such a role. There were no vast underground command bunkers like those later built during the Cold War. There were no giant electronic operations centers filled with computer screens. There were no satellite communications or secure video conferences connecting world leaders in real time. Instead, there was an aging mansion built in the late 18th century, whose elegant rooms now had to function as the nerve center of a global war. The transformation began immediately. Almost overnight, ordinary routines gave way to wartime necessity. Before the attack on Pearl Harbor, visitors to the White House often described an atmosphere that balanced formality with surprising accessibility. Members of Congress dropped by for meetings. Reporters mingled with officials. Social events regularly filled the calendar. Diplomats attended receptions beneath glittering chandeliers. Guests wandered through rooms decorated for state occasions. Now every visitor became a security concern. Every appointment required closer scrutiny. Every package entering the building was examined more carefully. Every unfamiliar face attracted attention. The Secret Service had always protected the president, but the nature of that protection changed dramatically after December 1941. The possibility of assassination remained a constant concern. Now another danger had been added: enemy sabotage. Although no realistic threat existed of Japanese bombers appearing over Washington in late 1941, Fear had a powerful effect on decision-making. Government officials had watched European capitals endure devastating air raids. London had suffered through the Blitz. Warsaw, Rotterdam, Belgrade, and countless other cities had experienced destruction from above. Washington wondered if one day it might face the same fate. As a result, preparations began. One of the most noticeable changes came after sunset. For generations, the White House had stood brightly illuminated against the Washington skyline. Now blackout precautions became part of everyday life. Heavy curtains were installed over many windows to reduce the amount of light escaping into the night. Exterior lighting was reconsidered. Government offices across the Capitol practiced blackout drills. Civil defense officials wanted Americans to become accustomed to the possibility, however remote, that enemy aircraft could someday appear overhead. To modernize, these precautions might seem excessive. After all, Japanese bombers never attacked Washington. German bombers never crossed the Atlantic. But the people making these decisions did not possess the advantage of hindsight. They remembered how quickly European assumptions about safety had collapsed. Only a few years earlier, many citizens of Britain had believed their island nation was secure. Then came nightly bombing raids. The lesson was simple. Prepare before disaster arrives, not afterward. Inside the White House, another transformation unfolded in rooms few Americans had ever seen. The heart of the wartime White House would not be the Oval Office. It would be a suite of offices known as the Map Room. Originally, the room had served relatively ordinary purposes. During the war, however, it evolved into one of the most important intelligence centers in the United States. Its location was carefully chosen. Situated on the ground floor of the White House, close to the president's living quarters, but separated from the constant activity of public offices, it allowed Roosevelt rapid access to the latest military information at almost any hour. The room itself was not especially large. It was functional rather than impressive. Maps covered the walls. Large tables supported charts and documents. Telephones connected officers to military headquarters across Washington. Filing cabinets overflowed with reports. Every available surface seemed occupied by papers marked secret, confidential, or top secret. The atmosphere was entirely different from the ceremonial grandeur upstairs. There were no crystal chandeliers here, no state portraits, no elegant receptions, only information, constantly changing, constantly arriving, constantly demanding attention. The officers assigned to the map room worked around the clock, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. War did not pause because it was midnight in Washington. While Roosevelt slept, battles continued in North Africa. Convoys crossed the Atlantic. Submarines hunted merchant ships. Aircraft carriers maneuvered through the Pacific. Time zones ensured that somewhere on Earth, American forces were always engaged. Someone inside the White House always had to know what was happening. Messages arrived through an astonishing variety of channels: Army communications, Navy dispatches, diplomatic cables, British intelligence summaries, weather reports, shipping updates, reconnaissance photographs. Every piece of information had to be organized, evaluated, and delivered quickly. Speed mattered. An outdated report could lead to a flawed decision. Accuracy mattered even more. The challenge facing the map room staff was enormous. Imagine trying to follow military operations across 6 continents and 2 vast oceans without modern computers. Every fleet movement had to be plotted by hand. Every army advance marked on physical maps. Every supply convoy tracked individually. When information changed, maps had to change with it. Officers often worked exhausting shifts, updating charts with colored pins, strings, handwritten notes, and grease pencils. The walls themselves became living records of the war. Roosevelt loved maps. Friends and advisors noticed this long before the war. He possessed an instinctive understanding of geography and often examined maps with remarkable attention to detail. He wanted to know not only where battles occurred, but why they occurred there. Why was one mountain pass so important? Why did one small island suddenly become strategically valuable? Why did certain ports matter more than others? These questions reflected Roosevelt's broader way of thinking. He rarely viewed military events in isolation. Every battle connected to supply lines. Supply lines depended upon ports. Ports depended upon geography. Geography influenced economics. Economics shaped industrial production. Everything connected. The map room allowed him to see those connections visually. Visitors occasionally found the president studying maps long after scheduled meetings had ended. He would trace shipping routes across the Atlantic with one finger, examine the distances between Pacific islands, compare weather patterns, discuss railway networks in Europe. The war, in Roosevelt's mind, was not simply a collection of battles, it was a vast logistical puzzle. Winning required understanding the entire board. Communication became another obsession. The White House already possessed an impressive telephone system by the standards of the day. During wartime, however, ordinary telephones were no longer sufficient. Sensitive conversations demanded greater security. New secure lines connected the White House with the War Department, the Navy Department, and other critical government offices. Operators underwent additional training. Procedures became stricter. Messages were carefully logged. Certain conversations took place only over specially designated circuits. Still, technology had limitations. Unlike today, secure global communication remained slow and complicated. A message from London might require coding, transmission, decoding, verification, and delivery before Roosevelt finally read it. Urgent reports sometimes traveled surprisingly slowly by modern standards. That delay could be frustrating. It also made trustworthy messengers invaluable. Military couriers became familiar figures inside the White House. Day and night, they hurried through corridors carrying locked briefcases containing dispatches that could alter military strategy. Some documents traveled only by hand. No telephone, no radio, no telegraph. The fewer people who handled the information, the smaller the chance of interception. Secrecy became an everyday habit. Even within the White House, staff members often knew only what they needed to know. A butler serving dinner might recognize famous generals sitting around the table, but have no idea what plans were being discussed. A secretary might type classified correspondence without knowing the larger operation it supported. Maintenance workers repaired electrical systems inside rooms filled with military maps, yet remained excluded from strategic conversations. Compartmentalization protected secrets. It also created an unusual atmosphere. People sensed history unfolding around them while rarely seeing the entire picture. The White House residence itself also adapted. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt still lived there, family members still visited, meals were served, birthdays were celebrated, Christmas decorations appeared during the holidays. Yet domestic life increasingly revolved around military schedules. Dinner might be interrupted by an urgent telephone call. Guests might excuse themselves for classified meetings. The president often disappeared into conferences that lasted late into the night. The distinction between home and workplace gradually disappeared. For Roosevelt, there was almost no separation at all. He could leave a family gathering and within minutes be examining casualty reports from the Pacific. He might finish lunch, then immediately meet with British military planners. After an evening reception, he could spend hours reviewing convoy losses in the Atlantic. The White House allowed him to move effortlessly between personal and official responsibilities. It also ensured that the war followed him everywhere. The staff adapted accordingly. Butlers learned to serve meals around unpredictable schedules. Housekeepers quietly adjusted routines to avoid interrupting sensitive meetings. Chefs prepared food that often sat untouched, while discussions ran longer than expected. Telephone operators became experts at determining which interruptions truly could not wait. Everyone developed a heightened awareness of urgency. One forgotten message, one delayed document, one misplaced file. The consequences might extend far beyond Washington. The building itself began showing signs of strain. Originally completed in 1800, the White House had undergone numerous renovations over the decades, but it remained an old structure supporting an increasingly modern government. New communication equipment demanded additional wiring. More telephones required expanded switchboards. Extra offices placed pressure on limited space. The growing wartime bureaucracy seemed determined to occupy every available room. Desks appeared in corners previously left empty. Cabinets filled hallways. Typewriters multiplied. Stacks of classified files seemed to grow faster than anyone could organize them. Noise increased as well. The quiet rhythm of a presidential residence gave way to the constant sounds of wartime administration. Telephones ringing, typewriters clacking, footsteps echoing through marble corridors, doors opening and closing, military officers discussing operations in low voices, the distant hum of radio equipment. The building never truly fell silent. Even after midnight, activity continued somewhere inside. Yet despite this transformation, Roosevelt remained determined that the White House should not become a fortress, cut off from ordinary Americans. He believed symbols mattered. If citizens saw their president hiding behind overwhelming security, they might conclude the government had lost confidence. Instead, Roosevelt tried to preserve as much normalcy as circumstances allowed. Public ceremonies continued. Press conferences remained frequent. Visitors still arrived, though under tighter controls. The White House projected calm, even when those inside knew that crises were unfolding almost hourly. It was a careful balancing act. Too much openness risked security. Too much secrecy risked public fear. Finding the middle ground became another wartime responsibility. Within weeks of Pearl Harbor, the transformation was complete. The White House no longer resembled the executive residence Americans had known before the war. It had become something entirely new. A home, a military headquarters, an intelligence center, a diplomatic crossroads, a communications hub, a symbol of national resilience. And increasingly, it became the place where leaders from across the Allied world would gather to decide the future of the war itself. The mansion had changed. Soon, the people walking through its doors would change with it. When historians describe World War II, they often focus on famous names: Franklin Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, George Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, Douglas MacArthur. These men appear in photographs, speeches, and history books. Their decisions shaped campaigns across the globe. But inside the White House, the war depended on many people whose names most Americans never learned. The president could not read every message, answer every telephone, schedule every meeting, prepare every meal, guard every doorway, or carry every secret document. Behind Roosevelt stood an entire network of aides, officers, secretaries, butlers, housekeepers, cooks, chauffeurs, and messengers who kept the wartime White House functioning 24 hours a day. In many ways, they formed an invisible government inside the visible one. What made Roosevelt's inner circle unusual was not just its size, it was the way he used it. Franklin Roosevelt disliked rigid hierarchies. He preferred information to flow through multiple channels. One advisor might present a military assessment. Another might offer a political warning. A third could share something heard from a governor, a journalist, or a labor leader. Roosevelt often encouraged competing opinions rather than demanding immediate agreement. This created an atmosphere that was both energetic and exhausting. People around him learned that a casual conversation in a hallway could become important. A remark made during lunch might influence a policy discussion later that evening. The president constantly gathered impressions, stories, and ideas. To outsiders, the White House sometimes looked chaotic. To Roosevelt, It was a system. At the center of that system stood a small group of trusted aides who enjoyed unusually direct access to the president. One of the most important was Harry Hopkins. Hopkins had begun as a New Deal administrator, but during the war he became something far more significant. Thin, intense, and often in poor health, he possessed Roosevelt's complete confidence. Hopkins could enter the president's office at almost any hour. He carried messages between Roosevelt and Churchill, negotiated with foreign leaders, and helped coordinate the massive flow of American aid to Allied nations. Visitors quickly noticed something unusual. Hopkins did not behave like a traditional government official. He often looked tired. He worked from his room inside the White House residence. Papers covered his bed, his desk, and nearby chairs. Yet foreign leaders treated him with extraordinary respect because they understood a simple fact. If Hopkins spoke, Roosevelt was listening. Churchill later remarked that Hopkins seemed to carry the authority of the president himself. Another crucial figure was Admiral William "Pa" Leahy. Leahy had once served as Chief of Naval Operations and later became Roosevelt's senior military advisor. Calm, experienced, and rarely dramatic, he acted as a bridge between the president and the armed forces. While generals and admirals sometimes argued fiercely over strategy, Leahy often helped Roosevelt sort through competing recommendations. His nickname, Pa, reflected his reputation as a steady, paternal presence. In a building filled with strong personalities, steadiness was valuable. Then there was General Edwin "Pa" Watson, one of Roosevelt's closest military aides. Watson controlled access to the president with remarkable skill. Cabinet members, senators, diplomats, and generals all learned that Watson could make meetings happen or delay them. He protected Roosevelt's time, managed schedules, and quietly handled countless problems before they reached the president's desk. Power in the White House was not always visible. Sometimes it belonged to the person who decided who got through the door. The military aides formed another essential layer of Roosevelt's inner circle. These officers worked extraordinarily long hours. They carried classified documents, coordinated communications, arranged transportation, monitored military developments, and ensured that the president received critical information quickly. Many were relatively young compared with the senior commanders they served. Their job required discretion above all else. A military aide might overhear discussions about invasions, intelligence operations, or diplomatic negotiations that could not become public for decades. One careless comment at a restaurant or train station could endanger lives. Secrecy became second nature. But the White House war effort depended on far more than senior advisors. Consider the secretaries. In an age before computers, every speech, memo, letter, and military directive had to be typed by hand. White House secretaries worked at astonishing speed. They produced multiple copies of classified documents, corrected revisions, coordinated correspondence, and kept track of a flood of paperwork that seemed to grow larger every week. Many of these women handled information of enormous importance. One afternoon, they might type a message to Churchill. The next morning, a directive affecting troop movements. By evening, revisions to a presidential speech. Yet most remained almost completely unknown to the public. Their reward was rarely recognition. It was trust. The telephone operators occupied another critical position. During the war, communications were the lifeblood of government. Calls arrived from military headquarters, governors, foreign embassies, members of Congress, and Allied leaders. Operators had to connect conversations quickly while maintaining strict confidentiality. They often knew who was calling before anyone else did. A sudden request from London at midnight. An urgent call from the War Department. A line reserved for the president. The operators became experts at sensing which interruptions truly could not wait. Meanwhile, downstairs in the White House kitchen, another kind of wartime work continued. The cooks faced a peculiar challenge. The White House remained a symbol of the nation, so formal dinners and diplomatic meals still mattered. At the same time, the country was encouraging ordinary citizens to conserve food, save fat for war production, and accept rationing. The kitchen had to balance dignity with restraint. Menus became simpler than many people expected. Luxury for its own sake was increasingly avoided. Meals needed to impress visiting leaders without appearing extravagant during a national emergency. The staff became remarkably creative. They adjusted recipes to account for rationing, substituted ingredients when supplies were scarce, and prepared food on schedules that changed constantly because meetings rarely ended when planned. A state dinner might be delayed by a military briefing. Coffee could be requested at 2 in the morning. Sandwiches might be sent to officers working in the map room long after midnight. The kitchen never truly closed. The butlers and valets witnessed another side of wartime leadership. They saw Roosevelt when reporters were absent and ceremonies were over. They observed the physical toll of his schedule. The president often worked late into the night, reviewed documents in bed, and moved between meetings with astonishing endurance despite the effects of polio. Many staff members developed deep loyalty to him. Part of that loyalty came from Roosevelt's personal style. He frequently remembered names, asked about families, and treated long-serving employees as individuals rather than invisible servants. White House workers later recalled that he understood how much the institution depended on people at every level. Eleanor Roosevelt strengthened that culture. Unlike many first ladies of earlier generations, she moved through the White House with unusual independence. She spoke regularly with staff members, visited work areas that guests rarely saw, and showed genuine interest in the lives of employees. Housekeepers, cooks, ushers, and clerks often found her easier to approach than they expected. Her presence changed the atmosphere. The White House still had formal rules, but it felt less rigidly aristocratic than many presidential residences had before. This mattered during the war. Employees were working longer hours under intense pressure. Knowing that the president and first lady noticed their efforts helped sustain morale. One group that rarely received attention was the messenger corps. Young couriers carried documents between the White House, the War Department, the Navy Department, and other agencies across Washington. They traveled through the city at all hours, often with locked briefcases handcuffed to their wrists or kept under constant supervision. In an era before secure digital networks, these messengers were part of the nation's communications infrastructure. A delayed courier could delay a decision. A lost document could create a security crisis. The responsibility was enormous. The White House also relied heavily on African American staff members, many of whom served as butlers, maids, cooks, ushers, and maintenance workers. Their contributions were essential, yet they worked within a country that remained deeply segregated. Washington itself was a segregated city. Many restaurants, hotels, and public facilities still enforced racial barriers. The contrast was striking. Employees could help serve world leaders inside the White House while facing discrimination outside its gates. Eleanor Roosevelt became increasingly outspoken about these contradictions. Her relationships with black leaders, artists, educators, and activists brought issues of civil rights closer to the center of presidential life than ever before. Not everyone inside the administration welcomed that change, but the conversations were happening. Even in wartime, the White House could not escape the larger questions shaping American society. As the months passed, the staff developed routines that would have seemed unimaginable before Pearl Harbor. People learned to sleep lightly. Telephones might ring at any hour. A convoy disaster in the Atlantic, a crisis in North Africa, an urgent message from Churchill, news from the Pacific. The war respected no schedule. Some employees later said they measured time not by days of the week, but by military events. One week became the week of the North African landings. Another became the week Sicily was invaded. Global events dictated the rhythm of life inside the mansion. The emotional strain could be heavy. Casualty reports arrived constantly. Staff members had relatives in uniform. Secretaries typed letters announcing deaths. Officers read reports describing sunk ships and destroyed aircraft. The White House was geographically far from the battlefields, but the human cost of the war reached its corridors every day. Yet moments of humor survived. Roosevelt enjoyed stories and jokes. Churchill's visits often produced late-night conversations filled with wit. Staff members occasionally encountered surprising scenes, generals arguing over maps, the president teasing an aide, or Roosevelt's dog Fala wandering through a room full of military officers as if he outranked them all. Those moments mattered. They reminded everyone that the people directing the war were still human beings. Perhaps the most remarkable feature of Roosevelt's inner circle was how many different backgrounds it included. Military officers, career civil servants, political advisors, domestic staff, diplomats, secretaries, messengers, engineers, cooks. Each performed a different task, but together they created something larger than any one individual. The White House functioned because hundreds of people understood their role in a national effort that extended far beyond Washington. Most would never appear in history books. No battles were named after them. No monuments celebrated their work. But every invasion plan, every diplomatic message, every presidential speech, and every late-night strategy session depended on their efforts. When visitors walked through the White House during World War II, they often saw only the famous faces. What they rarely saw was the invisible machinery of people quietly carrying papers, preparing meals, connecting calls, updating maps, opening doors, guarding secrets, and keeping the most important building in America running through the longest war the nation had ever fought. History usually remembers the leaders. Inside the wartime White House, victory depended on the people standing just outside the camera's frame. If Franklin Roosevelt was the center of military strategy inside the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt became its conscience. Long before the United States entered World War II, she had already transformed what it meant to be First Lady. Previous First Ladies had certainly influenced presidents behind the scenes, hosted receptions, and supported charitable causes. But Eleanor believed the position could be something far greater. She saw it as an opportunity to connect the White House with ordinary Americans, to listen to people whose voices rarely reached the highest levels of government. By the time Pearl Harbor changed the course of history, she had already spent years building that connection. She traveled constantly. She visited schools, hospitals, factories, mining towns, farms, universities, and struggling communities still recovering from the Great Depression. She wrote newspaper columns, gave lectures, answered thousands of letters, and spoke directly to millions through radio broadcasts. Some Americans admired her energy, others thought she was far too outspoken. But almost everyone agreed on one thing. No First Lady had ever worked like Eleanor Roosevelt. That tireless approach did not slow down after December 7, 1941. If anything, the war expanded her responsibilities even further. Inside the White House, Eleanor maintained an office that often looked more like a busy newsroom than the workplace of a traditional presidential spouse. Stacks of letters covered desks. Reports from aid organizations arrived daily. Appointment books filled rapidly. Telephones rang almost continuously. Secretaries struggled to keep pace with requests from military families, civic groups, journalists, women's organizations, educators, and ordinary citizens seeking help. Every morning brought another mountain of correspondence. Some letters came from soldiers preparing to leave home. Others came from worried mothers. Factory workers described long shifts producing aircraft and tanks. Teachers wrote about shortages in classrooms. Children sent drawings to the White House. Widows asked for assistance. Immigrants expressed gratitude for America's support against fascism. Not every letter received a personal reply. There simply were too many. But Eleanor insisted that they all be read. She believed those letters offered something no intelligence report or political briefing could provide. They revealed the emotional condition of the nation. In many ways, Eleanor became Franklin Roosevelt's unofficial window into everyday American life. When she returned from trips across the country, she often brought stories rather than statistics. She would describe conversations with factory workers exhausted after 12-hour shifts. She spoke about young women entering industrial jobs once reserved almost exclusively for men. She talked about families carefully saving ration coupons. She shared observations from military hospitals where wounded servicemen faced long recoveries. These stories mattered. The president already received detailed reports from military commanders and cabinet officials. Eleanor supplied something different. She explained how government decisions actually affected ordinary people. Franklin listened carefully. Although the Roosevelts' marriage had changed dramatically over the years, they retained a remarkable partnership. They no longer fit the image of a conventional husband and wife. Each maintained separate schedules. Each pursued independent interests. Each developed close friendships outside the marriage. Yet politically and intellectually, they remained deeply connected. Almost every evening, Eleanor shared what she had seen during the day. Sometimes she challenged administration policies directly. Sometimes she simply described what Americans were experiencing. Either way, the president gained insights that few other leaders possessed. The White House staff quickly learned that Eleanor kept an entirely different pace from her husband. Franklin often worked late into the night. Eleanor usually began astonishingly early. She frequently rose before sunrise, reviewed correspondence, met visitors, wrote articles, and attended multiple events before many officials had even arrived at their offices. Her schedule exhausted younger aides. One secretary later joked that keeping up with Eleanor Roosevelt required the stamina of an Olympic athlete. Unlike Franklin, who relied heavily on advisors bringing information to him, Eleanor preferred going directly to the source. She visited defense factories where thousands of Americans now built bombers, tanks, ships, and ammunition. These factories represented one of the greatest industrial transformations in history. Just a few years earlier, many had produced refrigerators, automobiles, sewing machines, or farm equipment. Now assembly lines manufactured B-17 bombers, Sherman tanks, Liberty ships, and countless other tools of war. Eleanor walked those factory floors. She spoke with welders, inspectors, assembly workers, engineers. She asked questions few reporters bothered to ask. How long was your shift? Do you have enough childcare? What problems are you facing? What would make your work easier? Those conversations frequently influenced discussions back at the White House. The war was changing American society at an extraordinary pace. Millions of men entered military service. Their departure created enormous labor shortages. Factories needed workers immediately. Women answered that call in unprecedented numbers. Images of Rosie the Riveter eventually became symbols of the American home front, but behind the famous posters were millions of real women learning skills that society had often insisted were beyond their abilities. Eleanor became one of their strongest advocates. She argued that women were not merely replacing absent men, they were proving their own capabilities. When she visited aircraft plants, she saw women riveting aluminum panels onto bombers. At shipyards, women operated heavy machinery. In laboratories, they conducted scientific research. Across government offices, women assumed responsibilities that would have been considered impossible only a few years earlier. She celebrated these changes publicly. Not everyone approved. Some critics insisted women should return to exclusively domestic roles. Others worried that changing workplace traditions threatened established social norms. Eleanor rarely backed away from such debates. She believed the war had revealed talents that America could no longer afford to ignore. Her commitment to racial equality also intensified during these years. The contradiction troubled her deeply. America fought a war against racist ideologies overseas while segregation persisted throughout much of the United States. Black Americans served in uniform, worked in defense factories, built ships, produced aircraft, yet many still faced discrimination in housing, transportation, education, and military assignments. Eleanor spoke openly about these injustices. She visited historically black colleges, supported civil rights organizations, invited African American leaders to the White House. Sometimes these actions generated fierce criticism, but she believed silence would be far worse. One of the most important aspects of Eleanor's wartime role involved military hospitals. As casualty numbers increased, thousands of wounded servicemen returned home. Many faced amputations, blindness, burns, psychological trauma that today would likely be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Eleanor refused to treat these visits as ceremonial appearances. She spent hours talking with patients, listening, encouraging, writing letters on behalf of soldiers unable to write themselves. Doctors later remembered how naturally she interacted with the wounded. She did not rush from bed to bed offering rehearsed speeches. She asked about families, future plans, recovery. She treated injured servicemen not as symbols of sacrifice, but as individuals. Word spread quickly through military hospitals. When Mrs. Roosevelt visited, patients expected genuine conversation, not publicity. Her travels eventually extended far beyond the United States. In 1943, Eleanor undertook one of the most remarkable journeys ever made by a First Lady. She traveled thousands of miles across the Pacific. The trip involved military transport aircraft, rough airfields, unpredictable weather, and long distances over open ocean. Many advisors worried about the risks. The Pacific remained an active war zone. Japanese forces still controlled large portions of the region, yet Eleanor insisted on going. She wanted to see conditions firsthand. During the journey, she visited hospitals, air bases, supply depots, and frontline installations. She met nurses working under exhausting conditions, pilots preparing dangerous missions, Marines recovering from combat, engineers constructing airfields on remote islands. Soldiers were astonished. Many had never expected to see the First Lady standing in front of them in a distant corner of the Pacific. Her presence carried symbolic weight. It reminded servicemen that the White House had not forgotten them. One pilot later remarked that Eleanor seemed less interested in speeches than in listening. She wanted to know what troops needed, what problems they faced, whether supplies were adequate, whether morale remained strong. When she returned to Washington, she brought those observations directly to the president. No official report could fully replace first-hand experience. Back inside the White House, Eleanor also influenced wartime diplomacy in subtle ways. Foreign visitors often discovered that conversations with the First Lady differed significantly from formal meetings with the president. She asked about education, families, living conditions, children, women's experiences during the war. These discussions sometimes revealed social and humanitarian issues overlooked during military negotiations. Visiting dignitaries quickly realized that Eleanor possessed her own influence. Ignoring her would be a mistake. Despite her enormous workload, she continued writing. Her newspaper column, My Day, appeared almost daily. Through it, Americans gained a unique glimpse into wartime life. She discussed travel, volunteer work, food conservation, community projects, the importance of tolerance. She encouraged citizens to participate actively in the national effort rather than simply observing events from a distance. Her writing style mirrored her personality, direct, honest, accessible. She rarely sounded distant or aristocratic. Instead, readers often felt she was speaking to them personally. Inside the White House, however, not everyone agreed with her activism. Some advisors worried she spoke too freely. Others believed she involved herself in controversial issues that distracted from military priorities. Franklin occasionally found himself balancing these concerns, yet he almost never attempted to silence her. He understood that Eleanor reached audiences he could not. She connected with Americans emotionally. He led strategically. Together, they formed complementary halves of wartime leadership. The White House itself reflected that partnership. Franklin's offices became the center of military planning. Eleanor's offices became a crossroads of humanitarian concerns. One side discussed troop deployments, the other discussed refugee relief. One examined naval operations, the other examined school lunch programs. Both were essential. Victory required more than winning battles. It required preserving the society those battles sought to defend. Perhaps nothing demonstrated Eleanor's character more clearly than her relationship with the White House staff. She remembered names, asked about illnesses, checked on family members serving overseas, stopped to speak with housekeepers, gardeners, cooks, and clerks. Many employees later recalled that she made them feel like participants in a shared mission rather than anonymous workers. Morale mattered. She understood that instinctively. Years later, numerous White House employees remembered Franklin Roosevelt as an extraordinary president. They remembered Eleanor Roosevelt as someone who noticed them. That distinction became part of her legacy. By the later years of the war, Eleanor Roosevelt had fundamentally changed public expectations of the First Lady. No longer was the role confined primarily to hosting dinners and decorating reception rooms. It had become a platform for advocacy, communication, diplomacy, and national service. Future First Ladies would approach the office differently because Eleanor had expanded its possibilities. But during World War II, few people paused to think about history. There was simply too much work to do. Every week brought new battles, new casualties, new challenges. And somewhere in the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt continued reading another stack of letters, preparing for another journey, or sitting beside another hospital bed, quietly reminding a nation at war that behind every military statistic stood a human life. While Franklin Roosevelt directed the strategy that would help defeat the Axis powers, Eleanor Roosevelt helped preserve something equally important: the humanity of the people fighting the war. During World War II, there were moments when the White House felt less like the home of an American president and more like the headquarters of an international alliance. Its front doors welcomed a remarkable parade of visitors: prime ministers, kings, generals, scientists, resistance leaders, diplomats, military planners. Some arrived with great ceremony, greeted by military bands and photographers. Others slipped quietly through side entrances under heavy security, their visits known only to a handful of officials. Every arrival carried enormous significance. Inside the White House, conversations held over dinner or beside a fireplace could influence military campaigns stretching from the frozen forests of the Soviet Union to the jungles of Burma. No visitor, however, left a greater impression than one man: Winston Churchill. The British Prime Minister first came to the White House only weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor. For Churchill, the timing was deeply emotional. For more than 2 years, Britain had fought Nazi Germany largely alone in Western Europe. London had endured relentless bombing during the Blitz. British merchant ships crossed the Atlantic under constant threat from German submarines. Resources were stretched thin, and although Britain had survived, victory still seemed far away. Churchill had spent months trying to persuade the United States to become more deeply involved in the conflict. Now, after Pearl Harbor, America was finally in the war. He wasted no time crossing the Atlantic. His journey itself reflected the dangers of wartime travel. German U-boats prowled the ocean. Enemy aircraft posed a constant threat. Every movement of Allied leaders had to remain secret until after they arrived safely. When Churchill reached Washington in late December 1941, the White House became his home for nearly 3 weeks. It was an extraordinary arrangement. Today, it would be difficult to imagine the leader of another major power living inside the White House for weeks at a time. But Roosevelt believed proximity mattered. Formal meetings around conference tables had their place. So did conversations over breakfast, late-night discussions, evening drinks. Some of the most important strategic decisions of the war emerged not from rigid diplomatic ceremonies, but from hours of informal conversation between two men who had developed enormous mutual respect. The personalities of Roosevelt and Churchill could not have been more different on the surface. Roosevelt projected calm optimism. He smiled easily. He enjoyed stories, practical jokes, and gentle political maneuvering. Even during crises, he rarely allowed panic to dominate his public image. Churchill, by contrast, was theatrical. He spoke dramatically. He loved history, literature, and grand speeches. His booming voice could fill a room. He smoked large cigars almost constantly. His appetite for food, conversation, and work seemed endless. Yet beneath those differences lay remarkable similarities. Both believed Nazi Germany posed an existential threat to civilization. Both understood the importance of industrial production. Both recognized that the alliance between Britain and the United States would determine the course of the war. Most importantly, both genuinely enjoyed each other's company. White House staff quickly noticed that Churchill followed few conventional schedules. He often worked late into the night, slept during the afternoon, and resumed discussions well after midnight. Roosevelt, himself accustomed to long working hours, adapted surprisingly well. Meetings frequently continued long after aides expected them to end. Military officers sometimes waited outside, unsure whether strategy discussions had concluded or simply shifted into storytelling. Churchill possessed an extraordinary memory. He quoted poetry, recited passages from history, compared current military operations to battles fought centuries earlier. Roosevelt responded with anecdotes, humor, and political insight. The two leaders challenged each other intellectually while maintaining an atmosphere of friendship. One famous story perfectly captures Churchill's personality. During one White House visit, Roosevelt arranged to see Churchill after the Prime Minister had finished bathing. When the President entered Churchill's room, he reportedly found the British leader completely naked. Churchill, entirely unconcerned, is said to have declared, "The Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." Whether every detail of the story unfolded exactly as remembered is impossible to know. But it reflected something real about Churchill. He disliked unnecessary formality. The White House gradually became less of a diplomatic venue and more of a shared headquarters. Meals often evolved into strategy sessions. After dinner, maps appeared, military advisors entered. Discussions continued for hours. Servants quietly refilled coffee cups while Allied strategy took shape around the table. The atmosphere fascinated White House employees. Butlers serving meals might recognize that they were witnessing conversations destined for history books. Yet professional discretion demanded silence. They carried plates, poured drinks, cleared tables, and revealed almost nothing afterward. Churchill was not the only remarkable guest. Throughout the war, the White House welcomed an astonishing range of Allied leaders. Military commanders arrived to brief Roosevelt before major operations. General George Marshall came frequently, often carrying updates from the Army. Admiral Ernest King discussed naval campaigns stretching across 2 oceans. General Henry Hap Arnold reported on the rapidly expanding Army Air Forces. These meetings were rarely ceremonial. They involved difficult questions. How quickly could troops be trained? Were enough landing craft available? Could supply ships survive German submarine attacks? Which theater deserved priority, the Pacific or Europe? Every answer carried enormous consequences. Sometimes disagreements became intense. One of the greatest strategic debates involved a deceptively simple question: which enemy should America defeat first? Many Americans understandably wanted immediate revenge against Japan after Pearl Harbor. The attack had outraged the nation. Yet British leaders argued that Nazi Germany represented the greater long-term threat. Germany possessed a far larger industrial base, advanced military technology, control over much of Europe. If Hitler defeated the Soviet Union while Japan occupied the Pacific, the Allies might face an almost impossible challenge. Roosevelt ultimately supported what became known as the Germany First strategy. It was politically risky. Many citizens wanted the Pacific prioritized. Yet Roosevelt believed defeating Germany would eventually make victory over Japan far easier. Discussions leading to that decision occurred repeatedly inside the White House. They were not always smooth. Strong personalities defended competing priorities. The debates remained professional, but could become remarkably blunt. Another frequent visitor was General Dwight Eisenhower. Early in the war, Eisenhower remained relatively unknown outside military circles. Unlike famous battlefield commanders, he had never led troops in combat. His greatest strength lay elsewhere: organization, coordination, diplomacy. He possessed an unusual ability to persuade strong-willed commanders from different countries to work together. Roosevelt recognized those qualities early. Meetings inside the White House gradually increased Eisenhower's visibility. Before long, he would command the largest Allied invasion force ever assembled. Many visitors arrived under extraordinary secrecy. Scientists involved in highly classified research occasionally met with senior officials. Although the details of the atomic bomb project remained among the war's greatest secrets, Roosevelt quietly received updates on scientific developments that could reshape the conflict. Only a tiny circle of advisors knew the full scope of these programs. Even many cabinet members remained unaware. The White House also became a gathering place for intelligence officials. Representatives from American and British intelligence agencies exchanged information behind closed doors. They discussed intercepted communications, resistance movements, enemy troop movements, double agents, code breaking. None of these subjects appeared in newspaper headlines. Yet they influenced countless military decisions. One of the greatest strengths of the Allied partnership was its willingness to share intelligence. That trust developed gradually. The White House played an important role in building it. Foreign royalty also visited. Among the most notable were King George VI and Queen Elizabeth of Britain, whose earlier visit in 1939 had helped strengthen Anglo-American relations before the United States entered the war. Although that visit preceded Pearl Harbor, its importance became even clearer afterward. Personal relationships established during peacetime helped ease wartime cooperation. Roosevelt believed diplomacy was not conducted only through official treaties. Friendships mattered. Trust mattered. Shared experiences mattered. The White House therefore remained more than an office building. It became a home where alliances could grow naturally. Meals reflected that philosophy. State dinners during wartime differed significantly from their pre-war counterparts. Rationing encouraged restraint. Menus became simpler. Displays of extravagance would have appeared insensitive, while millions of Americans conserved food and soldiers fought overseas, yet elegance did not disappear. White House chefs demonstrated remarkable creativity. Fresh seasonal ingredients replaced elaborate luxury. American regional dishes sometimes appeared alongside traditional diplomatic cuisine. The meals themselves encouraged conversation. Roosevelt preferred round-table discussions to rigid seating arrangements. He wanted guests to interact freely. The dining room became another negotiating room. Not every meeting involved military strategy. Some addressed post-war planning. Even while battles raged, Allied leaders debated what kind of world should emerge afterward. How should Germany be governed after defeat? Should colonial empires survive? How could another global war be prevented? What role should international organizations play? Many of the ideas that eventually contributed to the creation of the United Nations began taking shape during conversations involving Roosevelt and visiting leaders. The White House was planning not only how to win the war, but also how to preserve the peace. Staff members often marveled at the sheer diversity of languages, uniforms, and cultures passing through the building. British officers in khaki, American admirals in navy blue, foreign diplomats wearing formal dress, resistance representatives arriving quietly with classified information, scientists carrying technical reports. The executive mansion had become a crossroads of the free world. Security naturally tightened during these visits. Secret Service agents coordinated closely with military police. Travel schedules remained confidential. Windows were monitored, entrances controlled. Even kitchen staff sometimes learned only at the last moment how many guests would attend dinner. Surprise protected lives. Despite the immense pressure, moments of warmth persisted. Churchill particularly enjoyed staying at the White House because it felt less formal than many European government residences. He wandered through corridors in slippers, requested midnight meals, stayed awake discussing history while exhausted aides struggled to keep their eyes open. Roosevelt appreciated that informality. He believed genuine relationships produced better decisions than endless protocol. Perhaps that was the White House's greatest advantage during the war. It was simultaneously a residence and a command center. Leaders did not simply meet there. They lived together, shared meals, laughed, argued, reflected, built trust. By the time they returned to London, Moscow, or military headquarters, they knew one another as people rather than distant officials. That trust would prove invaluable, because as the war expanded across the globe, the decisions made inside the White House required cooperation on a scale the world had never seen before. No nation, not even the United States, could achieve victory alone. Inside those familiar white walls, an alliance was learning how to fight as one. If there was one room inside the White House that truly became the heartbeat of America's war effort, it was not the Oval Office. It was not the Cabinet Room. It was not the East Room, where presidents welcomed foreign leaders beneath crystal chandeliers. Instead, it was a relatively modest room tucked away on the ground floor, a place that most Americans never saw and whose existence remained largely unknown throughout the war. The White House Map Room. By the end of World War II, millions of people would remember Roosevelt's speeches. Very few would know where many of his decisions had actually begun. The map room was born out of necessity. In the days immediately following Pearl Harbor, information flooded Washington at a pace the government had never experienced before. The Army had its own reporting system. The Navy maintained another. The State Department received diplomatic cables from embassies around the world. British intelligence sent regular updates. The FBI, military intelligence agencies, and code-breaking organizations all generated their own reports. Each department collected valuable information. The problem was that much of it arrived separately. Roosevelt disliked that arrangement. He wanted one place where the most important military and diplomatic information could be gathered, organized, and presented quickly. Not tomorrow, not in several hours, immediately. Thus, the White House Map Room became a centralized intelligence hub, unlike anything that had previously existed inside the executive mansion. Its mission sounded simple: tell the president what was happening. The reality was anything but simple. Imagine trying to monitor a war stretching across nearly every continent on Earth. Fighting raged from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of New Guinea. Convoys crossed the icy North Atlantic. Submarines stalked merchant ships beneath the waves. Bombers flew over Germany. Chinese armies resisted Japanese advances. Partisans sabotaged railroads across occupied Europe. Resistance fighters transmitted coded messages from France. Every day, thousands of individual events occurred. Some would become major turning points. Others would disappear into history. The challenge was determining which was which. The officers assigned to the map room became experts at exactly that. Most came from the Army and Navy. They worked in rotating shifts that ensured someone was always on duty, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Christmas, New Year's Day, birthdays, none of it mattered. War never stopped. Neither could they. The room itself rarely looked dramatic. Hollywood often portrays wartime command centers as enormous halls filled with glowing lights and giant maps. The actual map room was far more practical. Large wall maps covered different theaters of war: Europe, the Atlantic, the Pacific, North Africa, Asia. Tables held stacks of reports waiting to be reviewed. Telephones lined desks. Typewriters clicked almost constantly. Small colored pins marked the positions of fleets, armies, and air forces. Strings connected shipping routes across oceans. Grease pencils allowed officers to update changing front lines directly onto map overlays. Nothing remained static for long. By morning, an entire battlefront might have shifted. One of the map room's greatest strengths was speed. Every incoming report followed a carefully organized process. A coded message might first arrive through military communications. Specialists decoded it. Its accuracy was verified. Relevant information was extracted. If the report affected presidential decision-making, it was immediately summarized. Then came perhaps the most important step: context. Roosevelt did not simply want isolated facts. He wanted to understand what those facts meant. A convoy had lost 3 ships. Was that unusually high? A German offensive had stalled. Why? Japanese aircraft appeared over a Pacific island. How many? Were they preparing for invasion or conducting reconnaissance? Information without explanation was incomplete. The officers learned to anticipate Roosevelt's questions. That was no easy task. The president possessed an extraordinary curiosity. He frequently interrupted briefings not because he doubted the information, but because he wanted to understand the bigger picture. If an officer reported that Allied forces had landed on Sicily, Roosevelt might immediately ask about nearby ports, railways, mountain ranges, weather. How quickly supplies could reach advancing troops. What effect the campaign might have on German deployments elsewhere. The conversation rarely stayed confined to one battlefield. Everything connected. The map room therefore became far more than a collection of maps. It became a place where geography, logistics, intelligence, economics, and military strategy merged into a single picture. Roosevelt loved that approach. He had always possessed a fascination with geography. Even before becoming president, he studied naval history extensively. He understood coastlines, harbors, shipping lanes, ocean currents. He appreciated that geography often determined history. The war only strengthened that belief. Consider the Atlantic Ocean. To most people, it appeared simply as a vast body of water separating North America from Europe. To Roosevelt, it represented a lifeline. Every soldier sent to Britain, every tank, every aircraft, every truck, every crate of ammunition, every sack of flour, every gallon of fuel, all had to cross the Atlantic. If German submarines cut that lifeline, Britain might collapse regardless of battlefield victories. Each morning, convoy reports became essential reading. Colored pins marking merchant ships slowly moved across Atlantic maps. Green might represent Allied convoys. Red could indicate known submarine activity. Blue marked friendly naval forces. Officers constantly adjusted these markers as fresh intelligence arrived. Sometimes they celebrated. A convoy reached Britain safely. A U-boat had been sunk. Escort carriers proved successful. Other days brought grim news. Several merchant ships torpedoed overnight. Heavy losses, missing vessels. The map room reflected the emotional rhythm of the war itself. Victories never lasted forever. Neither did defeats. The Pacific created an entirely different challenge. Distances were almost unimaginable. Many islands appeared insignificant on ordinary world maps. Tiny dots surrounded by endless ocean. Yet in the map room, those dots carried enormous strategic importance. Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each represented airfields, harbors, supply bases, stepping stones toward Japan. Roosevelt often examined Pacific maps carefully. Visitors occasionally found him tracing possible routes between islands with his finger. The geography fascinated him because every mile mattered. Aircraft had limited range, ships required fuel, troops needed supplies. An island only a few miles wide could determine the success of an entire campaign. The map room also tracked weather with surprising attention. Modern audiences sometimes underestimate weather's influence on World War II. Storms delayed invasions. Fog concealed fleets. Cloud cover affected bombing accuracy. Heavy seas complicated amphibious landings. Meteorological reports therefore occupied valuable space alongside intelligence summaries. One inaccurate forecast could influence thousands of lives. Beyond military operations, diplomatic developments also flowed into the room. Embassies transmitted assessments of foreign governments. Resistance movements reported conditions inside occupied territories. Neutral nations revealed economic trends. Political changes sometimes proved just as significant as battlefield victories. Roosevelt understood that wars ended through diplomacy as well as military force. Another remarkable feature of the map room was its connection to British intelligence. The alliance between American and British intelligence services deepened throughout the war. Information crossed the Atlantic almost continuously, intercepted communications, reconnaissance reports, naval sightings, economic analyses. The White House increasingly benefited from intelligence collected by an international network rather than solely American agencies. Trust became one of the alliance's greatest weapons. Of course, not every report proved accurate. Fog of war affected information just as surely as it affected soldiers on battlefields. Early reports frequently contained mistakes. Enemy strength might be exaggerated, friendly losses underestimated. Rumors occasionally appeared alongside confirmed intelligence. Map-room officers therefore developed a healthy skepticism. Verification became essential. Multiple sources were compared, conflicting reports investigated. Only after careful evaluation did the most important information reach Roosevelt. The president appreciated honesty. He disliked certainty unsupported by evidence. If officers were unsure, he preferred hearing, "We don't know yet," rather than confident speculation. That attitude shaped the culture of the map room. Accuracy came before speed whenever possible. Still, there were moments when speed simply had to win. One such example occurred during major Allied invasions. Whether in North Africa, Sicily, Italy, or eventually Normandy, reports arrived almost minute by minute. Landing craft delayed. Paratroopers scattered. Enemy resistance stronger than expected. Bridges captured. Roads blocked. The atmosphere inside the map room became electric. Telephones rang constantly. Couriers hurried through hallways. Maps changed repeatedly within the same hour. Roosevelt often requested updates several times a day. He understood that the first 24 hours of an invasion frequently determined its success or failure. The room's importance extended beyond the president himself. Senior advisors also relied upon its information. Harry Hopkins visited regularly. Admiral Leahy consulted reports before military meetings. Generals arriving from the Pentagon often compared their own intelligence with map-room summaries. In effect, the room became a common reference point for wartime decision-making. One of its least appreciated contributions involved record-keeping. Every message, every map, every update, every summary. Everything was preserved carefully. Staff members understood they were documenting history even while living through it. Those records would later become invaluable to historians reconstructing wartime events. For the officers working there, however, history felt very personal. Many had friends or relatives serving overseas. When casualty reports arrived, they knew the statistics represented real people. A ship sunk in the Atlantic, a bomber lost over Germany, a Marine division fighting on a Pacific island. Behind every map symbol stood thousands of individual lives. That realization weighed heavily. Some officers later admitted they found it difficult to celebrate victories fully because they also saw the accompanying casualty lists. Success carried a price. Perhaps the most extraordinary aspect of the map room was how ordinary it appeared. No crowds, no applause, no newspaper photographers. Visitors rarely entered. Most Americans had no idea it existed. Yet from this quiet room, Roosevelt followed the greatest war in human history almost hour by hour. By the later years of the conflict, he had developed a remarkable routine: morning updates, afternoon reviews, late-night consultations. He could ask detailed questions about convoy movements one moment and Soviet advances the next. The map room made such awareness possible. It gave the president something no previous American leader had ever possessed: a near-continuous picture of a global war. Looking back today, it is easy to take such awareness for granted. Modern presidents receive satellite imagery, live video feeds, encrypted digital communications, and real-time intelligence from around the world. Roosevelt had none of those technologies. Instead, he relied on dedicated officers, paper maps, telephones, radio transmissions, and thousands of carefully organized reports. By the standards of the 1940s, it was revolutionary. The White House map room quietly changed the presidency. It demonstrated that modern warfare required constant information, centralized analysis, and rapid communication between civilian leadership and military commanders. Future presidents would build larger command centers, more advanced technology, underground situation rooms, digital intelligence systems. But the basic idea that the president needed a dedicated place where the world's events could be gathered, analyzed, and understood was born in those modest rooms beneath the White House. There, surrounded by maps covered in colored pins and handwritten notes, America learned that in a global war, information could be just as decisive as armies. History often remembers great victories: the successful landings in Normandy, the liberation of Paris, the capture of Iwo Jima, the surrender of Germany, the surrender of Japan. These moments dominate documentaries because they offer something every storyteller loves: clear endings. But inside the White House, history rarely looked that simple. There were no dramatic musical scores, no narrator announcing that victory was inevitable. No one could turn the page to see what happened next. Every morning, Franklin Roosevelt and his advisors confronted a reality far more unsettling. They were making decisions without knowing whether they were right. Sometimes they had hours to choose, sometimes only minutes. And almost every choice carried consequences measured in thousands or even hundreds of thousands of lives. The burden was unlike anything an American president had ever experienced. Before World War II, presidents certainly faced wars. Abraham Lincoln carried the weight of the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson led the nation through the First World War. But Roosevelt confronted something different: a conflict stretching across 6 continents. Millions of soldiers, thousands of ships, tens of thousands of aircraft, entire economies devoted to destruction. And because America had become the industrial heart of the Allied coalition, almost every major campaign depended in some way upon decisions made in Washington. The White House had become a place where impossible choices arrived every day. One of the first dilemmas involved priorities. Resources were never unlimited. No matter how powerful the United States became, there were always more requests than supplies. The Army wanted additional tanks. The Navy demanded more destroyers. The Army Air Forces requested thousands of bombers. Britain needed food. The Soviet Union needed trucks. China required ammunition. Factories worked around the clock, yet production could never satisfy everyone simultaneously. Who should receive new aircraft first? Britain? The Pacific? Training units inside the United States? Every answer meant someone else would have to wait. Roosevelt understood a painful truth. Choosing one priority automatically created another sacrifice. Military planners frequently arrived carrying detailed production reports: steel output, aircraft deliveries, ship construction, rubber supplies, fuel reserves. The numbers filled page after page, but behind every statistic stood human lives. If landing craft production slowed, an invasion might be delayed. If escort ships remained unavailable, merchant convoys faced greater danger. If bomber production increased, fighter aircraft might become temporarily scarcer. The president constantly balanced these competing needs. Sometimes there was no perfect solution, only the least dangerous one. Another enormous source of pressure came from casualty reports. They arrived almost every day. At first, Roosevelt insisted on seeing detailed summaries. He wanted to understand the true cost of the war: Army losses, naval sinkings, aircraft destroyed, civilian casualties. The reports became a grim routine. Some mornings brought encouraging news. Others delivered devastating statistics. A successful campaign might still cost thousands of lives. Even victories hurt. Members of the White House staff later remembered the emotional effect these reports produced. Roosevelt rarely displayed overwhelming emotion in public. Privately, however, he understood exactly what those numbers represented. Every casualty telegram would eventually reach a family: a mother, a father, a wife, children, entire communities. He knew America could tolerate sacrifice. What it could not tolerate was meaningless sacrifice. That belief influenced nearly every major military decision. Roosevelt frequently challenged commanders with difficult questions. Was the objective worth the expected losses? Had every alternative been considered? Could additional preparation reduce casualties? Some generals occasionally grew frustrated. War, they argued, inevitably involved losses. Roosevelt agreed. But he believed leaders had a moral obligation to question every assumption before sending young Americans into combat. Perhaps no issue better illustrates the impossible nature of wartime leadership than the debate over strategic bombing. Throughout the war, Allied bombers increasingly attacked German industrial cities. The goal appeared straightforward: destroy factories, disrupt transportation, reduce Germany's ability to produce weapons, shorten the war. Military planners argued that strategic bombing would ultimately save lives by weakening the enemy before ground invasions occurred. The theory sounded convincing. Reality proved far more complicated. Bombing accuracy remained limited. Weather often interfered. Industrial targets stood inside populated cities. Civilian casualties became unavoidable. Every briefing inside the White House raised uncomfortable questions. Would destroying a factory justify the deaths of nearby civilians? Could bombing break enemy morale, or would it strengthen resistance? These were not theoretical debates. Real aircraft departed every day. Real bombs fell. Real families died. Roosevelt rarely spoke publicly about these moral dilemmas. Privately, he wrestled with them alongside his advisors. No option felt entirely clean. Meanwhile, another deeply controversial decision unfolded much closer to home. In early 1942, fear swept across America's west coast. The attack on Pearl Harbor remained fresh in everyone's memory. Japanese submarines appeared offshore. Rumors spread rapidly. Many officials worried that enemy agents might conduct sabotage inside the United States. Against this atmosphere of fear, the Roosevelt administration approved the forced relocation and internment of more than 100,000 Japanese Americans, the vast majority of whom were American citizens or long-term legal residence. Inside the White House, supporters argued that the measure protected national security. Critics warned it violated fundamental constitutional principles. The decision reflected one of the darkest chapters of Roosevelt's presidency. At the time, fear often overwhelmed evidence. Military necessity was invoked. Public pressure intensified. Yet history would later judge the policy very differently. Looking back, many historians conclude that prejudice, wartime panic, and political pressure played major roles alongside genuine security concerns. The White House itself reflected those tensions. Leaders were attempting to protect the nation while also preserving the democratic values for which they claimed to be fighting. Sometimes those goals collided. The conflict revealed how even democratic governments can make deeply flawed decisions during moments of extreme fear. Roosevelt also faced relentless political pressure. Unlike dictators, he remained accountable to voters, Congress, governors, newspapers, and public opinion. Every major decision attracted criticism from somewhere. Some politicians insisted America should devote more resources to Europe. Others argued the Pacific deserved greater attention. Labor unions demanded fair wages. Business leaders requested regulatory flexibility. Farm organizations sought production assistance. Military families wanted better support. Each group believed its concerns deserved immediate attention. Most genuinely did. The president had to decide among them. Visitors often imagined the White House as a place where answers emerged quickly. In reality, uncertainty dominated many discussions. Roosevelt encouraged debate. General George Marshall might recommend one strategy, Admiral Ernest King another. Harry Hopkins could introduce political considerations. Economic advisors examined industrial capacity. Diplomats evaluated international consequences. Only after hearing competing perspectives would Roosevelt move toward a decision. Sometimes he delayed intentionally. Waiting another day might produce better intelligence. Sometimes delay itself became dangerous. Every hour mattered. One example came before the Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942. Operation Torch represented America's first major offensive against German forces. The risks were enormous. Would French forces resist? Could supplies cross the Atlantic safely? Would Germany reinforce North Africa before Allied troops landed? Failure might damage American credibility at the very moment Allied unity mattered most. Roosevelt approved the operation despite considerable uncertainty. Success eventually justified the decision. At the time, however, success was anything but guaranteed. The emotional pressure accumulated year after year. Roosevelt rarely enjoyed genuine vacations. Even when he traveled to Hyde Park or the presidential retreat at Shangri-La, later renamed Camp David, the war accompanied him. Couriers arrived carrying dispatches. Telephones connected him with Washington. Military advisors traveled nearby. There was no escape. Staff members noticed physical changes. The president already lived with the long-term effects of polio, requiring immense effort simply to maintain the appearance of strength in public. Now the demands of wartime leadership added another burden: long hours, irregular meals, interrupted sleep, constant travel, unending responsibility. The strain became increasingly visible, yet he almost never allowed it to appear before visitors. That ability impressed foreign leaders. Churchill once remarked upon Roosevelt's remarkable composure. Even during military setbacks, the president projected confidence, not false optimism, determination. He believed leadership required emotional discipline. If the president appeared defeated, the nation might follow. The White House staff adopted that same attitude. Bad news circulated constantly: ships sunk, bombers lost, cities captured by enemy forces. Yet work continued, maps updated, telephones answered, meals served, reports typed. Everyone understood that discouragement could become contagious. Professionalism became its own form of resilience. The pressure extended beyond military affairs. Economic management remained critical. Factories required raw materials. Railroads transported enormous quantities of equipment. Rationing affected millions of households. Inflation threatened purchasing power. The White House monitored food production almost as carefully as battlefield operations. Winning required not only defeating enemy armies, but sustaining America's economy throughout years of total war. Another impossible question loomed over every discussion. How long would the war last? No one knew. Some hoped victory might come quickly after America's industrial strength entered the conflict. Others warned the struggle could continue for many years. Without knowing the answer, Roosevelt had to prepare for both possibilities: expand production, train millions of soldiers, construct thousands of ships, develop new technologies, support allied nations. Everything required enormous investment. Everything depended upon uncertain predictions. Perhaps the greatest burden of all involved secrecy. The president often knew information he could never share. He learned about upcoming invasions months before they occurred. He received intelligence from codebreakers revealing enemy intentions. He approved covert operations whose existence remained hidden. He sometimes spoke publicly, while privately knowing far more than anyone listening. That isolation came with leadership. Some secrets protected lives, others protected entire campaigns. Silence became another responsibility. Years later, many White House staff members reflected on one surprising aspect of Roosevelt's leadership. He almost never claimed certainty when certainty did not exist. He asked questions, requested additional information, listened carefully, changed course when necessary. Strength, in his view, did not require pretending to know everything. It required making the best possible decision with imperfect information. That lesson may have been the most enduring legacy of the wartime White House, because history often celebrates victories as though they were inevitable. Inside the White House, nothing ever felt inevitable. Every success stood on countless uncertain decisions. Every triumph carried hidden doubts. Every victory emerged from leaders forced to choose between imperfect options, knowing that whatever they decided, someone, somewhere, would pay the price. Within those white walls, the greatest battles were not always fought with tanks or bombers. Sometimes they were fought in quiet rooms, around polished wooden tables where maps lay open, casualty reports waited to be read, and the weight of history rested on a single decision. To the outside world, the White House during World War II appeared almost mythical. Newspapers showed photographs of President Franklin Roosevelt meeting generals, welcoming Allied leaders, or delivering speeches that reached millions of Americans over the radio. The building itself became a symbol of confidence. It represented stability in a world that seemed to be collapsing. But behind the public image was something surprisingly ordinary. People lived there. They woke up every morning, shared meals, argued over schedules, celebrated birthdays, walked their dogs, worried about family members serving overseas, laughed, grieved, waited for good news that sometimes never came. For all its historical importance, the White House remained a home. That simple fact shaped life inside the executive mansion in ways that are often overlooked. Each day began long before the public ever heard the president's voice. Before dawn, lights flickered on in service areas hidden from visitors. The kitchens came alive first. Cooks prepared breakfast not only for the Roosevelt family, but also for dozens of staff members whose shifts had already begun. Fresh coffee filled the corridors. Bakers prepared bread and pastries. Large pots simmered. Deliveries arrived through entrances most Americans never saw. Unlike a private home, the White House functioned more like a small village. Dozens of employees quietly moved through its halls before sunrise. Housekeepers checked guest rooms. Engineers inspected heating and electrical systems. Gardeners stepped outside to care for the grounds, regardless of the season. Telephone operators relieved the overnight staff. Military aides reviewed messages that had arrived while Washington slept. To visitors, the building appeared effortlessly organized. In reality, maintaining that illusion required hundreds of people performing hundreds of separate tasks. Franklin Roosevelt usually began his mornings by reviewing newspapers and briefing materials. He liked to understand both public opinion and classified developments before the day's meetings began. Breakfast often became part of the workday. Advisors occasionally joined him. So did family members. The atmosphere varied. Some mornings felt almost relaxed. Others were dominated by reports from distant battlefields. The war respected neither mealtimes nor family routines. One unexpected telegram could change the entire day's schedule. The Roosevelt family itself brought a unique energy to the White House. Unlike some presidents whose children were young while they occupied the mansion, Franklin and Eleanor's children were adults during World War II, yet they remained deeply involved in national life. Their sons entered military service. That fact carried symbolic importance. Many American families had children serving overseas. The president's family was no exception. James Roosevelt joined the Marine Corps. Elliott Roosevelt served in the Army Air Forces. Franklin Roosevelt Jr. entered the Navy. John Roosevelt also served. For Eleanor and Franklin, the war was never merely an abstract national crisis. It touched their own family. Although their sons generally avoided public attention regarding military assignments, the knowledge that they too faced wartime risks resonated with many Americans. The president understood what thousands of parents experienced each day, waiting, hoping, wondering. Inside the residence, grandchildren occasionally visited, bringing brief moments of normal family life. The contrast could be remarkable. One room might contain maps showing battles across Europe. Another echoed with the laughter of children. That coexistence of ordinary life and extraordinary responsibility defined the wartime White House. Perhaps no member of the household became more beloved than a small Scottish terrier named Fala. Officially named Murray the Outlaw of Fala Hill, the dog quickly became Franklin Roosevelt's constant companion. Fala followed the president almost everywhere. He rode in automobiles, accompanied Roosevelt on trains, appeared during vacations, and wandered confidently through the White House as though he understood he belonged there. Staff members adored him. Visitors remembered him. Photographers frequently captured his image. Military officers sometimes found themselves discussing global strategy while Fala slept peacefully nearby. The little dog provided something surprisingly valuable, a reminder that life contained more than war. Roosevelt himself clearly enjoyed Fala's company. The president's demanding schedule left little room for relaxation, yet even brief moments with the dog seemed to lighten the atmosphere. Employees noticed the effect. Conversations became less formal. Guests smiled. The tension eased, if only briefly. Years later, Fala would become one of the most famous presidential pets in American history. During the war, however, he simply helped make the White House feel like a home. Meals reflected another fascinating aspect of wartime life. Contrary to popular imagination, White House dining during World War II was often remarkably modest. Rationing affected everyone, including the presidential household. Although special accommodations existed for official state dinners and foreign leaders, Eleanor Roosevelt strongly believed that the White House should reflect the sacrifices expected of ordinary Americans. Menus became simpler, less wasteful. Seasonal ingredients gained greater importance. Victory gardens appeared across the nation, encouraging families to grow vegetables at home. The White House promoted similar ideas. There was symbolism in restraint. If ordinary citizens accepted ration books while the president enjoyed extravagant banquets every evening, public confidence might erode. Instead, moderation became part of leadership. Not everyone appreciated the simpler meals. Some guests privately admitted they found White House cuisine less impressive than expected. Eleanor accepted the criticism, demonstrating shared sacrifice mattered more than dazzling visitors with luxury. Still, the kitchen staff displayed remarkable creativity. Limited ingredients did not prevent excellent cooking. Experienced chefs adapted recipes, substituted products when shortages occurred, and prepared elegant meals from surprisingly modest resources. Many visiting leaders later remembered the warmth of the hospitality more than the complexity of the menu. The White House social calendar changed dramatically during the war. Before Pearl Harbor, Washington had enjoyed an active season of receptions, concerts, dances, and formal entertainment. Much of that disappeared. There were still official dinners and diplomatic events, but celebrations became noticeably more restrained. The nation remained at war. Extravagance felt inappropriate. Instead, many gatherings focused on boosting morale. Military bands performed. War bond events attracted celebrities. Volunteers were honored. Nurses received recognition. Factory workers visited. The White House became a place where ordinary Americans occasionally found themselves standing beside famous generals or foreign prime ministers. These encounters reinforced an important message. The war belonged to everyone. Hollywood also entered the picture. Actors, musicians, and entertainers visited the White House with increasing frequency. Some came before departing on overseas tours organized to entertain troops. Others participated in war bond campaigns. The relationship between Washington and Hollywood grew much closer during the conflict. Movies had become one of America's most powerful forms of communication. The Roosevelt administration understood their influence. Films shaped public morale, explained rationing, encouraged enlistment, raised support for war bonds. While the White House never directly controlled Hollywood, the two worlds increasingly cooperated. Occasionally, evenings inside the executive mansion included private film screenings. Roosevelt greatly enjoyed motion pictures. Despite his overwhelming workload, he often watched films as a way to relax. Staff members later recalled that movies offered rare opportunities for the president to set aside military reports, if only temporarily. Comedy proved especially popular. Laughter became a valuable escape from the constant pressures of leadership. Music also remained important. The White House had long hosted concerts, and wartime did not end that tradition. Instead, performances often carried deeper emotional significance. Military musicians performed patriotic selections. Classical artists entertained guests. Sometimes songs reminded listeners of loved ones serving overseas. Other times they celebrated hope. Music accomplished something speeches often could not. It gave people a shared emotional experience. Christmas inside the wartime White House perhaps best illustrated the balance between tradition and sacrifice. Every December, decorations transformed parts of the mansion. Christmas trees appeared. Garlands decorated hallways. Holiday meals were prepared. Yet the celebrations inevitably reflected the war. Many decorations emphasized patriotism. Gifts remained modest. Thoughts frequently turned toward servicemen spending Christmas far from home. Eleanor Roosevelt devoted considerable attention to ensuring wounded veterans and military families felt remembered during the holidays. Special events honored those unable to celebrate with loved ones. The season carried both joy and sadness. White House employees also developed unusually close relationships with one another. Long hours naturally encouraged friendship. People celebrated weddings, supported colleagues facing illness, comforted co-workers who received tragic news from overseas. The building functioned not only as a workplace, but also as a community. One longtime usher later remarked that employees often knew one another's families almost as well as their own. Shared purpose created lasting bonds. Of course, difficult moments occurred as well. Tempers occasionally flared. Fatigue produced mistakes. Unexpected emergencies disrupted carefully planned schedules. No institution operating 24 hours a day escaped tension, yet professionalism usually prevailed. Everyone understood the importance of their work. The emotional atmosphere shifted noticeably as the war progressed. In 1942, uncertainty dominated. Would the Allies survive? Could America mobilize quickly enough? Would German submarines choke Atlantic supply routes? Would Japan continue advancing across the Pacific? By 1944, cautious optimism gradually replaced fear. Allied armies advanced through Europe. American industry reached astonishing levels of production. New aircraft entered service. Enemy forces increasingly retreated. Still, no one inside the White House celebrated prematurely. Too many battles remained. Too many families still waited for sons and daughters to come home. Then came moments of profound grief. Lists of casualties from battles like Anzio, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa reminded everyone that victory remained painfully expensive. Even in the final months of the war, thousands continued to die. Those reports arrived at the White House with relentless regularity. The staff never became truly accustomed to reading them. Perhaps that was a good thing. The cost of war should never feel routine. Visitors often imagined that living in the White House during World War II must have felt glamorous. The reality was far more complex. Yes, remarkable people walked its halls. Churchill, generals, kings, scientists, diplomats. But alongside those extraordinary encounters existed endless ordinary work. Floors needed cleaning. Meals required preparation. Laundry accumulated. Heating systems demanded maintenance. Flowers had to be arranged. Telephone calls answered. Letters sorted. History depended upon countless acts of quiet service. In many ways, that was the true character of the wartime White House. It stood at the center of world events without ever ceasing to be a functioning household. Its staff preserved traditions while adapting to unprecedented challenges. Its rooms witnessed both intimate family moments and decisions that reshaped continents. Within the same walls, a child might laugh, a cook might prepare supper, a general might outline an invasion, and a president might receive news that would alter the course of history. The White House was not simply where the war was directed. It was where life continued despite the war. And perhaps that quiet persistence, the determination to preserve ordinary human routines amid extraordinary global conflict, represented one of the greatest strengths of the American home front. Because every nation fighting World War II needed factories, needed armies, needed ships. But it also needed something less visible, the belief that normal life, however fragile, was still worth protecting. Inside the White House, that belief survived every single day. By the beginning of 1944, something inside the White House had begun to change. The atmosphere was still intense. Telephones still rang at all hours. The map room remained busy around the clock. Military officers hurried through corridors, carrying classified reports. The president continued meeting with generals, admirals, diplomats, and members of Congress. From the outside, it appeared that nothing had changed. But those closest to Franklin Roosevelt noticed subtle differences. He looked more tired. The long days seemed longer. The burdens of leadership, carried without interruption since 1933 and intensified beyond imagination after Pearl Harbor, had begun to leave visible marks. Roosevelt was only 62 years old. By modern standards, that hardly seems old for a national leader. Yet photographs from the final years of the war reveal a striking transformation. The broad smile remained. His confidence remained. His remarkable political instincts remained. But his face had grown thinner. His cheeks appeared more hollow. The energetic president who had led America through the Great Depression now looked physically exhausted. Most Americans did not fully understand why. The White House worked hard to preserve the image of a strong commander-in-chief. That was not unusual. Presidents of Roosevelt's era rarely shared detailed medical information with the public. His physicians understood that he suffered from serious health problems, including high blood pressure and heart disease. Only a small circle of advisors realized how severe his condition had become. The president himself often dismissed concerns. There was simply too much work to do. The war had reached its most decisive phase. In June 1944 came the operation that everyone inside the White House had anticipated for years: the invasion of Normandy, Operation Overlord, D-Day. Months before June 6th, preparations dominated conversations in Washington. The scale was almost beyond imagination. Thousands of ships, more than 150,000 Allied soldiers, airborne divisions dropped behind enemy lines, massive naval bombardments, an invasion force larger than anything previously assembled in history. If it failed, the consequences could be catastrophic. Another invasion might not be possible for years. Hitler would gain valuable time to strengthen Germany's defenses. The Soviet Union would continue bearing the overwhelming burden of fighting in Europe. The political consequences could be just as damaging. The White House understood exactly what was at stake. In the weeks before D-Day, Roosevelt's schedule grew even more demanding. Meetings multiplied, reports arrived constantly, weather forecasts became matters of national importance. Unlike modern presidents, Roosevelt could not watch live video from the beaches of Normandy. Instead, he relied on coded messages, military dispatches, and reports delivered to the map room. During those anxious hours, information arrived in fragments. Airborne units had landed. Some were scattered. The naval bombardment had begun. Resistance appeared heavier at certain beaches. Communications remained incomplete. No one possessed the entire picture. The uncertainty weighed heavily. White House staff later recalled the tension. People spoke quietly. Telephones seemed to ring more often than usual. Every new report attracted immediate attention. Had the landing succeeded? Were casualties acceptable? Would German armored divisions launch devastating counterattacks? For hours, no one knew. When encouraging reports finally began arriving, relief spread throughout the building. The invasion had not gone perfectly. Some beaches, particularly Omaha Beach, witnessed horrifying losses. Units became disorganized. Landing craft missed their assigned positions. German defenses proved stronger than expected. Yet the Allies had established a foothold in France. The impossible had become possible. The liberation of Western Europe had begun. Roosevelt addressed the nation that evening in a radio broadcast unlike any of his previous wartime speeches. Instead of announcing victory, he offered a prayer. He asked Americans to join him in asking for strength, courage, and protection for the men fighting across the English Channel. The choice reflected his understanding of the moment. The battle was far from over. Thousands were still dying. Triumphalism would have been deeply inappropriate. Throughout the summer of 1944, the White House followed Allied advances across France with cautious optimism. Paris was liberated in August. The news electrified Washington. For years, the French capital had symbolized Nazi occupation. Now its liberation represented far more than military success. It became proof that Germany could be defeated. Yet Roosevelt resisted any temptation to declare the war nearly won. He had learned long ago that optimism unsupported by reality could become dangerous. The German army remained formidable. The Pacific War continued with extraordinary violence. Victory still required patience. Meanwhile, another campaign unfolded, not overseas, but at home, the presidential election of 1944. Roosevelt had already served 3 terms. No American president had ever been elected to a 4th. Many believed he should retire. His health appeared uncertain. The responsibilities were immense. Some members of his own party quietly questioned whether another candidate might be preferable. Roosevelt listened. Then he decided to run again. His reasoning was straightforward. Changing leadership during the largest war in American history seemed too risky. Whether everyone agreed was another matter. The campaign itself differed dramatically from earlier elections. The war overshadowed almost everything else. Americans understood that whoever won would almost certainly oversee the final defeat of Germany and Japan. Roosevelt's opponent, Governor Thomas Dewey of New York, criticized aspects of the administration but largely avoided attacking the overall conduct of the war. National unity still mattered. One important change did occur during the Democratic Convention. Vice President Henry Wallace was replaced on the ticket by Senator Harry S. Truman. At the time, the decision generated political controversy. Few Americans realized how significant it would soon become. Inside the White House, Roosevelt continued working almost without pause. His schedule remained relentless. Briefings, cabinet meetings, military conferences, foreign correspondence, public appearances, radio addresses. The demands never eased, yet those around him increasingly noticed signs of fatigue. He sometimes appeared unusually pale. Walking, already difficult because of polio, seemed even more taxing. Extended meetings exhausted him more quickly. Still, he refused to reduce his workload substantially. The war came first. Early in 1945, Roosevelt undertook one of the most important journeys of his presidency. He traveled to the Crimean Peninsula for the Yalta Conference. There he met with Winston Churchill and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. The purpose extended beyond military coordination. Germany's defeat now seemed inevitable. The leaders needed to discuss what would happen afterward. How would Germany be occupied? What borders would change? How should liberated nations rebuild? Could a new international organization prevent another world war? These questions would shape global politics for generations. The journey itself demonstrated Roosevelt's determination. Traveling such distances while seriously ill demanded extraordinary effort. Those who saw him at Yalta often remarked upon his frail appearance. Churchill privately worried about his friend's health. Even Stalin reportedly noticed the physical decline. Yet Roosevelt remained mentally engaged. He negotiated, questioned, persuaded, compromised. His vision extended beyond military victory. He wanted an international system capable of preserving peace. One idea mattered especially to him: the creation of the United Nations. Roosevelt believed the failure of the League of Nations after World War I had contributed to the conditions leading to another global conflict. He hoped a stronger organization, supported by the world's major powers, might succeed where earlier efforts had failed. Many discussions at Yalta revolved around precisely that goal. Returning to Washington, however, Roosevelt appeared noticeably weaker. Doctors grew increasingly concerned. Some advisors quietly suggested reducing his workload. The president largely ignored them. Germany was collapsing. American forces advanced across the Rhine. The Soviet army approached Berlin. The Pacific War intensified. There was no time to step back. On March 1, 1945, Roosevelt addressed Congress after returning from Yalta. The speech revealed just how much he had changed. Unable to stand for long, he spoke while seated. At one point, he apologized to lawmakers. "I hope that you will excuse me for this unusual posture," he said, "but I know you will realize that it makes it a lot easier for me not to have to carry about 10 pounds of steel around on the bottom of my legs." The chamber laughed gently. Many assumed he referred only to the braces required because of polio. Few understood the full extent of his physical condition. Inside the White House, however, concern deepened. Staff members who had served Roosevelt for years sensed something was wrong. The president still smiled, still joked, still worked, but he no longer possessed the same reserve of energy. Even so, his determination never wavered. He continued reading reports from Europe and the Pacific. He continued discussing post-war planning. He continued preparing for peace even while the war continued. Then came April. On April 12, 1945, Roosevelt traveled to Warm Springs, Georgia, hoping for a brief period of rest while continuing official business. The White House remained in constant communication. Military reports still arrived, government work continued. During the afternoon, while sitting for a portrait, Roosevelt complained of a severe headache. Within hours, he was dead. A massive cerebral hemorrhage had ended the life of the only president many younger Americans had ever known. The news reached Washington with stunning speed. Inside the White House, disbelief spread through every corridor. Telephones rang continuously. Staff members wept openly. Secretaries stopped typing. Military aides struggled to maintain composure. For more than 12 years, Franklin Roosevelt had been the center of life, inside the executive mansion. Now he was gone. The timing seemed almost unimaginable. Germany stood only weeks from defeat. Victory appeared finally within reach. Yet the leader who had guided America through Depression and World War would not live to see either Germany surrender in May or Japan surrender later that summer. Vice President Harry Truman was summoned immediately. Only 82 days earlier, he had begun his vice presidency. Now, he would become president. When Truman arrived at the White House, Eleanor Roosevelt greeted him quietly. He reportedly asked if there was anything he could do for her. Her response has become one of the most famous exchanges in American history. "Is there anything we can do for you?" she replied. "For you are the one in trouble now." The weight of global war had passed to another man. Within the White House, Roosevelt's chair sat empty. His desk remained covered with papers awaiting his attention. Maps still displayed military operations. The war continued. The machinery of government could not stop. Yet the building felt profoundly different. The familiar voice that had echoed through its halls for more than a decade had fallen silent. For the staff, the loss was deeply personal. For the nation, it was almost unimaginable. For the world, it marked the end of an era. The president who had transformed the White House into the command center of democracy's greatest struggle would never witness the peace he had worked so tirelessly to secure. But his influence remained everywhere. In the alliances he had built, in the institutions he had envisioned, in the people he had led, and within the walls of the White House itself, where the echoes of his wartime leadership would continue to shape every presidency that followed. On the evening of May 8, 1945, less than a month after Franklin Roosevelt's death, thousands of Americans gathered outside the White House. The war in Europe was finally over. After nearly 6 years of conflict, Nazi Germany had surrendered. The crowds filled Lafayette Square and stretched along Pennsylvania Avenue. They sang patriotic songs, waved American flags, cheered until their voices grew hoarse. Many embraced complete strangers. For millions of people, it felt like the end of a nightmare. Yet inside the White House, the mood was more complicated. The building had lost its longtime resident only weeks earlier. Harry Truman, still adjusting to the presidency, now occupied the office where Roosevelt had spent more than 12 extraordinary years. The celebrations outside could not erase the sense of transition within. And even as Americans celebrated victory in Europe, another brutal war continued. Across the Pacific, Japanese forces still resisted with astonishing determination. The White House remained a wartime headquarters. The telephones continued ringing, military briefings continued, casualty reports continued. The work was not finished. For Truman, the experience was overwhelming. Unlike Roosevelt, who had spent years guiding American foreign policy before Pearl Harbor, Truman entered the presidency with remarkably little knowledge of many of the war's most closely guarded secrets. He later admitted that stepping into Roosevelt's office felt as though the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. Within hours of taking office, he began receiving classified briefings unlike anything he had ever experienced. He learned about intelligence operations, diplomatic negotiations, the status of military campaigns, and perhaps most startling of all, he was informed about the existence of the Manhattan Project, the secret effort to build an atomic bomb. Roosevelt had intentionally kept knowledge of the project confined to a very small circle. Even the vice president had not been fully informed. Now Truman inherited not only the presidency, but also one of the greatest scientific and military secrets in history. The White House once again became the place where decisions, unlike any before, would be made. As the summer of 1945 unfolded, American forces moved steadily closer to Japan, but every report reaching Washington carried a grim warning. Japanese resistance remained fierce. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa had demonstrated just how costly an invasion of the Japanese home islands might become. Military planners prepared estimates that varied widely, but nearly all agreed on one point: the human cost would be staggering. Inside the White House, discussions became increasingly urgent. Should America invade? Should the nation continue conventional bombing and naval blockade? Could Soviet entry into the Pacific War force Japan to surrender? Or should the new atomic weapon be used? These questions fell upon Truman rather than Roosevelt, yet they were debated within the same rooms by many of the same advisors inside the same White House that Roosevelt had transformed into the center of Allied strategy. History had changed presidents. It had not changed the burden of leadership. On August 6, 1945, the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. 3 days later, another bomb fell on Nagasaki. The destruction shocked the world. Within days, Japan announced its intention to surrender. On September 2, 1945, aboard the battleship USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, representatives of Japan formally signed the surrender documents. World War II had finally ended. For the first time in nearly 4 years, the White House was no longer directing a global war. The silence must have felt unfamiliar. There were still diplomatic crises, still political challenges, still economic concerns. But the endless cycle of invasion reports, convoy updates, casualty summaries, and battlefield intelligence had come to an end. The map room that had once tracked battles across every continent no longer followed a world engulfed in total war. Yet its influence did not disappear. In many ways, the wartime White House permanently changed the American presidency. Before Franklin Roosevelt, presidents certainly exercised military authority, but World War II expanded that responsibility to an unprecedented scale. The president now functioned as commander of a global alliance, leader of the world's largest industrial economy, chief diplomat, head of an enormous intelligence network, coordinator of scientific research, manager of a military establishment operating around the clock. Future presidents inherited that model. The White House itself also evolved. The wartime experience exposed the limitations of a 19th century mansion trying to serve as the headquarters of a 20th century superpower. Communication systems required modernization. Security demanded improvement. Staff structures became more professional. The need for centralized intelligence never disappeared. During the Cold War, these lessons became even more important. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy established the White House Situation Room. Its purpose echoed the mission of Roosevelt's map room: provide the president with accurate, up-to-date information from around the world. The technology had changed dramatically. The principle had not. Today's presidents receive satellite imagery, encrypted video conferences, cyber intelligence, and real-time battlefield reports. But the idea that the president requires a dedicated center for continuous global awareness traces directly back to the wartime innovations beneath Roosevelt's White House. The war also transformed the role of the First Lady. Eleanor Roosevelt demonstrated that the position could extend far beyond ceremonial duties. Her travels, humanitarian work, advocacy for civil rights, and direct engagement with ordinary citizens established a new model that influenced generations of First Ladies who followed. After leaving the White House, she continued shaping history. President Harry Truman appointed her as a delegate to the newly formed United Nations. There, she chaired the committee responsible for drafting one of the most influential documents of the 20th century, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The values she championed during the war, human dignity, equality, and international cooperation, continued guiding her work long after the fighting ended. The White House staff carried the war with them as well. Many employees served multiple presidents. They watched the building return to peacetime routines. State dinners once again emphasized celebration rather than wartime diplomacy. Tourists returned. Gardens flourished. Holiday traditions expanded. Yet those who had worked there during World War II never forgot what the mansion had once become. To them, every hallway held memories. The East Room recalled wartime ceremonies. The dining room reminded them of Churchill's late-night conversations. The residents brought memories of Eleanor reading letters from soldiers' families. The map room remained a symbol of sleepless nights spent following battles across distant oceans. The White House had not merely witnessed history, it had lived through it. Visitors today often admire the elegance of the building, the portraits, the architecture, the famous rooms where presidents greet foreign leaders. What they cannot easily see is the invisible history layered within those walls. Imagine standing in the Oval Office. The room appears calm, sunlight streams through the windows. Yet during World War II, that same space received reports that determined the fate of entire armies. Imagine walking downstairs toward the rooms once occupied by the map room. Today they serve different purposes, but decades ago, officers carefully moved colored pins across giant maps as they followed battles unfolding thousands of miles away. Imagine looking from the South Lawn toward the Washington Monument. The view seems peaceful, yet during the war, anti-aircraft preparations, blackout planning, and heightened security reflected fears that even America's capital might someday become a battlefield. The building remembers, even if visitors cannot hear its memories. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the wartime White House was not a particular decision or military strategy. It was the demonstration that democratic government could survive and even function effectively under extraordinary pressure. The United States fought the largest war in its history without canceling elections, without suspending Congress, without abandoning the peaceful transfer of presidential power. Mistakes were certainly made. Some decisions, such as the internment of Japanese Americans, remain enduring stains on that record. Others continue to be debated by historians, but the broader system endured. That mattered enormously. The Axis powers claimed democracy was weak, too slow, too divided, unable to manage modern warfare. The White House became living proof that free institutions, however imperfect, could mobilize vast resources, coordinate international alliances, and ultimately prevail against dictatorship. That lesson extended far beyond 1945. It shaped the decades that followed. Today, when people think about World War II, they often picture soldiers storming beaches, bombers flying over Europe, aircraft carriers crossing the Pacific, or factory workers building tanks and airplanes. Those images deserve their place in history. But behind every battlefield stood another front, a quieter one, inside a white mansion on Pennsylvania Avenue. There, military victories were translated into decisions. Alliances were strengthened, resources were allocated, letters from ordinary Americans were read. Families worried, leaders argued, maps were updated, phones rang deep into the night, and a democracy struggled with all its strengths and imperfections to guide the largest coalition the world had ever seen. The White House during World War II was never simply a residence. It was never simply an office. It was a home carrying the weight of a nation, a command center connected to every ocean and continent, a crossroads where generals, kings, scientists, journalists, servants, cooks, secretaries, and presidents all played their part in a shared story. Some shaped history through famous speeches, others through quiet acts no newspaper ever recorded. Together, they transformed an 18th-century mansion into the beating heart of the Allied war effort. Long after the guns fell silent, that transformation remained. Every president who has walked through the White House since then has inherited not only a building, but also a legacy forged during those extraordinary years. A legacy of impossible decisions, of tireless service, of leadership tested under unimaginable pressure, and of the enduring belief that even in humanity's darkest hours, the choices made inside a single house can change the course of the world. If you enjoyed this journey into history, please like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into America's untold stories. And if there's another chapter of American history you'd like us to explore, let us know in the comments. We read every suggestion.